4. A stay in Venice and onwards to Rome. St. Mark's Square, Fondaco dei Tedeschi, Basilica of St. Mark, Rialto and Market, Lazzaretto, Rome. Venice has become famous for its beauty, its incredible setting on over 100 islands within a half-moon lagoon, and its unique patina of Venetianness. Yet visitors often experience Venice as damp, fetid, expensive, too hot or too cold, haughty, unsexy, and moribund. And this is without even considering its entire subjugation to tourism. As is frequently observed, tourist Venice is the real Venice. The whole city has, for a very long time, been shaped by, commodified by, and subservient to the people going to or from other places. The friar Niccolò da Poggibonsi travelled through Venice on his way to the Holy Land in 1345. He described Venice as a city unlike any other, where all the roads, small and large, are channels in the water. Thus one went about by boat. Niccolò found it the best of ports because from Venice a man could find a ship to navigate to anywhere in the world where there was trade. He described a cityscape full of beautiful houses and many bell towers, some of them bending and squatting towards the water, as if defecating because of their bad foundations. He recognized that, because of its swampy setting in the sea, Venice presented unique difficulties in building a city. At times, Venice feels like a strange mirage, as though it is actually made of water and might slip away in a flood of light and shade. Most medieval cities had gates and established points of entry. Not so Venice. The city, as visitors approached it, was a muddle to the eye. Ferries and small craft skimmed across the lagoon to various points in the city. Felix Fabri, visiting from Ulm in the 1480s, noted, as his party sailed across the lagoon into Venice, his astonishment at such weighty and such tall structures with their foundations in the water. The most central destination was St. Mark's Square, the site of the ducal government, the Palazzo Ducale, rebuilt from 1340 with Gothic arches and loggia, and the ancient Basilica of St. Mark. This was close to Venice's other main focal point, the Rialto, the site of the city's legendary foundation. The Rialto, where since at least the 1170s a pedestrian bridge had crossed the Grand Canal, was the city's commercial heart and meeting place for merchants from around the world. The very openness of the city forced Venice to innovate in the administration of travel. The 15th century Venetian Republic led the world in the development of passports, travel guides and tourist offices, quarantine for travellers, public health regulations, and the supervision and policing of inns, restaurants, and shipping. Far from being an open city as it first appeared, late medieval Venice was full of invisible barriers, regulations, and bureaucracy. Yet, when visitors felt that Venice finally welcomed them into its secrets, the city seemed like an enchanted gift from history. Some people even said that Venice was built out of the stones of Troy. Be careful. When arriving in Venice, or sometimes even before you arrive as you sail across the lagoon towards the city, you'll be besieged by guides. The locals call them tolomazzi. They will show you around, translate all the different languages, and even book your passage to the Holy Land. But some are extortionists and liars, cheats, and hustlers. You must choose a licensed guide whom you can find each morning outside the Doge's palace and at the Rialto. Simon Fitzsimon, a friar on his way from Clonmel in Ireland to Jerusalem in 1323, was overwhelmed by the city's beauty and cleanliness, thinking that it might be set among the stars in the firmament rather than the sea. Fitzsimon described how 1/3 of the city is paved with baked bricks, while 2/3 are navigable liquid streets through which the sea flows and ebbs continuously and untiringly. He noted that at the Doge's palace at all times, live lions were tended, for the palace's glory and for the magnificence of its citizens. Noble visitors were announced at the Doge's court by a servant, seated under the Venetian flag, pounding out rhythmic beats on the ground with a heavy painted stick. One might have seen boys in parti-coloured costumes playing the rebec, and ladies in precariously high shoes to keep their feet dry, and collared dogs sitting patiently for their masters. There were jugglers, dwarves, and preachers, Heralds announced and sometimes sang the news from around the world. Beside this, at the entrance to St. Mark's Square by the lapping waves of the lagoon stood the two lean granite columns erected around 1200, dedicated to the city's patron saints St. Mark the Evangelist and St. Theodore, known locally as San Todaro. Theodore's statue comprised bits of old sculptures, a Roman emperor's head on another emperor's body. He stood atop his column astride a crocodile dragon added around 1300, representing victory. On top of St. Mark's column stood an ancient bronze-winged lion, the evangelist's symbol, which became the city's emblem and would be found throughout the Mediterranean on gates and portals and towers, wherever La Serenissima ruled the waves and the markets. Theodore has his back to the sea, looking into the city, watching over the people. The Lion of St. Mark looks eastwards, out of the city towards the lagoon, Lido, and the seas beyond. Waves reached ceaselessly at the city's wooden pilings and marble foundations. Venice was a place in constant movement. Migrants, merchants, slaves, mariners, pilgrims, refugees, and the rest of the world arrived and departed here. One of the things that defined a medieval city like Venice was that it enabled increased mobility, not just mobility through and between places, but also social and financial mobility. Venice was truly a hub of commerce where fortunes could be made and destinies changed. Even the city's patron Saint St. Mark was said to have once sought shelter in the city, an evangelist transported from the Levant to the maritime territory. And in the 9th century, Mark's voyage happened anew, as his saintly bones were purloined from Alexandria and enshrined in Venice. Many travellers through Venice were merchants, like Marco Polo, while others were missionaries, like Odoric of Pordenone, a Franciscan who crossed Asia from 1318 to 1329. Others set out to conquer the world in Venice's name. For instance, Marina Sanuda the Elder died 1343, who visited the Levant many times and fabricated a plan to occupy and annex Egypt. Or Niccolò Conti, who in the 1420s sailed through the Persian Gulf and all the way to India and up the river Ganges. Or Pietro Carini, who in 1432 was blown wildly off course and shipwrecked in the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway. Venice and the Venetians seemed connected to the widest possible version of the world. Fabrics from Persia and China, flour from the Levant, ships and their passengers from every port from Gibraltar to the Crimea, pilgrims from Iceland, Scotland, Sweden, France, Portugal, Poland, Armenia. The people of the globe gathered there on this unlikely collection of low-lying islands. Pietro Cassola, visiting in 1494 from Milan on his way to the Holy Land, said, "I do not think there is any city to which Venice, the city founded on the sea, can be compared." Cassola added that it seems as if all the world flocks there, and that human beings have concentrated there all their energies for trading. The French ambassador, Philippe de Comines, visiting in the same year as Cassola, was surprised by the city's situation, all in the water, and concluded that Venice is the most triumphant city that ever I saw. The English traveller, Thomas Lark, visiting in 1506 and writing for his patron Sir Richard Guilford, was overawed by Venice. The wealth, the sumptuous buildings, and the organisation of their justices and councils, along with all other things that make a city glorious, prevail in Venice above all other places that I ever saw. For Lark, as for many other visitors, Venice was a wonderland of monumental edifices built on islands. It crystallized some beautiful and striking idea of what a city could be. Cassola dedicated pages to praising Venice's merchandise and markets, seeing beauty in abundance, bedazzled by plenty. Yet his account of Venice repeatedly falters around an issue with which travellers often struggle. How does one give an account of a marvellous place, yet make it credible to those who haven't been there? I know it is difficult for anyone who has not seen these things to believe what I say, because I have fallen into the same error myself. That is, I used not to believe what was told me about them, he wrote. Eyewitness travellers often find it hard to convince their readers that what they've seen is reliable. The world, after all, was believed to be an ever-surprising encyclopedic garden of prodigies and miracles. Must see. On Ascension Day, there's a great fair at St. Mark's. There's also a ceremony, the Sposalizio del Mare, Wedding of the Sea, in which the Doge of Venice sails out in the ceremonial barge, the Bucintoro, and casts a wedding ring into the sea. This shows the indissoluble union between Venice and the waters on which it floats and prospers. Many travellers were in Venice in order to sail to the Holy Land. The city was the port of departure for Jaffa, then the key port for Jerusalem. The Venetian Republic was the main naval power for the entire eastern Mediterranean. The massive Arsenale, founded 1104, its ramparts glimpsed by visitors sailing through the city and sometimes visited as a spectacle in its own right, was the shipyard for military and civilian shipping. The name Arsenale comes from the Arabic Dar Sina, a place for construction, a building site. Its hundreds of boats sailed out daily across the world. The Venetian Republic encompassed a galaxy of territories across Dalmatia and the eastern Mediterranean, all the way to Alexandria, Beirut, and beyond the Crimea. These included a key trading post at Tana, now Azov, and the port of Kaffa, Feodosia, from which the Genoese and Venetians traded thousands of slaves, mostly Tatars and Circassians, Muslim and Christian. The Venetian Maritime Republic thrived on all kinds of business supported by the pilgrimage industry of holy tourism. Travellers lingered in Venice for some time. They were at the mercy of the patrons and galley captains who waited until the weather was right, or until they had forced the travellers into spending plenty of money in Venice. Marjorie Kemp stayed for 13 weeks in the spring of 1414, Pero Tafur for more than 30 days in 1436, Thomas Lark for 7 weeks from May to July 1506. Travellers like them had paid a deposit to shipping agents. If their boat went without them, how could they reach Jaffa? For Felix Fabri, after a few weeks in Venice, the city's charm started to pall. We began to become exceedingly weary of Venice and looked eagerly towards our departure, he wrote. He suspected that the captain of his galley had lied to him about their departure date. Many travellers like Fabri found themselves stuck in Venice, waiting to hear about their vessel leaving, spending too much money, and keen to quit the over-regulated city for the next stage of their journey. The entire business was regulated and controlled by the various officers of the Venetian Republic. The Tolomari constituted a kind of tourist office, supposed to assist travellers with finding a place to stay and negotiating their onward sea passage. The city's lodgings were also closely regulated and inspected by the Venetian Senate. Meanwhile, from 1292, the Ufficiali al Cataver oversaw laws and conditions relating to sea voyages. Accidents, rip-offs, disputes and disappointments were all bad for the Republic's trade and travel. Travellers, if they survived the trip, could complain to the Cataveri on their return journey. So good customer service and satisfied travellers were in the Republic's interests. Medieval travellers were used to carrying bills of safe conduct, aegidaticum, or letters patent. In Venice, the traveller's certification became a requirement, a duty. Venice developed an advanced system of individual certification in the form of the Bolletta del Passaggio, or Bolletta, Bollettino, Polizza, a document that at different times was a receipt for the payment of transit tolls, a bill of lading, a certificate of good health, or a passport. Any passport is a means to regulate the individual's movement, and the Venetian Bolletta did exactly that. Strangers disembarking in Venice were obliged to obtain a Bolletta for a fee, establishing their identity and certifying their intended route and, at times, that the place they came from was free from plague. It became more important than any pilgrim badge improving the traveller's credentials and ensuring their ability to travel. Pilgrims and merchants could then be required to show it throughout their journey from Venice to Jerusalem or Constantinople. The Bolletta was time-limited and could be furnished by the Tolomari or by a galley's patron. In addition, from the later 14th century, many other Italian cities, such as Florence and Livorno, required travellers to have a Bolletta di Sanità, a bill of health, showing that they weren't carrying the plague. By the later 15th century, visitors travelling alone or without a Bolletta were routinely suspected of being carriers of plague. Via the bolletta, the traveller became dependent on the administration of their journey and their legitimation through paperwork. The passport, always an anxiety-inducing document, had started to become the literal manifestation of each traveller's identity as a traveller. The well-developed and regulated hospitality industry in Venice meant that finding a place to stay was relatively straightforward, as long as a traveller had plenty of money. There were basic and ancient travellers' ospedali, refuges or infirmaries, where pilgrims coming to and from the Holy Land lodged alongside the poor and the sick. Tolomari also directed international travellers to ospizi, pilgrims' hospices, like the Ospizio Chelsea, founded 1409, on the Riva delle Schiavoni, a short walk from St. Mark's. A large number of public hostels and private locande and osterie, inns, clustered around the Ponte della Paglia, near the Rialto and around St. Mark's Square. For Northern Europeans, favourite inns included the San Zorzi, the George, run in the 1480s by a certain Margherita, who raised Felix Fabri's eyebrows by marrying her servant, Nicholas Frigg. Most Venetian inns had room for about 20 to 40 guests. These inns were subject to all kinds of regulation by the Republic's government. They were clustered together so the city's omnipresent authorities could keep an eye on behaviour there, fighting a losing battle against sodomy, theft, brawling and drunkenness. As elsewhere, inns weren't the same as taverns, which existed for drinking. As well as taverns, Venice had rough furratole, informal booths that sold fried fish and illicit wine. In inns and taverns, drinking alcohol was strictly regulated, policed by the Signori di Notte, the night watchmen or lords of the night, who also enforced regulations in the brothels and were said in their proceedings to employ torture on the curlo, rack. Family palaces took in guests and many religious infirmaries looked after pilgrims too. Some infirmaries were single-sex, others were located on their own islands in the lagoon. The grandest and most visible sign of Venice's welcome to foreigners was the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, a magnificent trading house for German merchants built in 1228, rebuilt in 1318 and 1505. The similar Venetian Fondaco dei Turchi for Turkish merchants and ambassadors only took on this role in 1621. The word fondaco, Venetian fontego, came from the Arabic funduk, a caravanserai, and ultimately from the Greek pandokeion, an inn, a place for everyone. It was a warehouse, hostel, tavern, showroom, refectory and community centre in one massive 80-roomed complex. Here, southern German merchants and emissaries established a powerful colony next to the Rialto, in the very best setting for commerce, on the central curve of the Grand Canal. As time went on, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi welcomed Austrian, Hungarian and all Northern European visitors to Venice. Various foreign communities, Albanians, Armenians, Burgundians, Greeks, Slovenes, Turks and many others, also had settlements in the city, often reflected in today's street names. Leo of Rosmetal, a Bohemian nobleman, and his squire, Wenzel Sasek, Václav Sasek, visited the Fondaco in 1467. Sasek wrote that any man from all the chief cities of all the Christian countries can each have his own table, where he can obtain whatever food and drink he desires. At the Fondaco, there were ample supplies of everything. In addition to such well-established places to stay, Venice also had albergarie, lodging houses, many unlicensed, scattered across the city and of ill repute. The Venetian Health Board, the Provveditori alla Sanità, founded in the 1480s, seems to have been particularly worried about the risk of contagion in these boarding houses, which were popular with visitors, part of the city's authorities' wider worries about disease in such a place of mobility. While visitors were detained in Venice waiting for their onward passage, there were plenty of relics, shrines and grand churches to see. Ogier d'Angleux, visiting in 1395, was particularly impressed by a relic of Goliath's tooth, which he saw in the chapel of one of Venice's charitable hospitals. William Way, visiting in 1458, noted in various churches the entire body of John the Baptist's father, St. Zacharias, and the bodies of St. Lucy, St. Sabina, St. Pancras, and St. Marina, as well as St. George's left arm and St. Christopher's thigh bone. In addition to these holy bodies and members, he saw a statue of the Virgin Mary made out of the very rock struck by Moses in the desert. And in the Basilica of St. Mark, a statue of Jesus was said to have been stabbed by a Jewish visitor 5 times and to have dripped with real blood. Through such sites, Venice itself became a pilgrimage destination, allowing travellers to justify their delays there with holy tourism. The unusual Basilica of St. Mark tended to dazzle its visitors. From the outside, it appeared squat and low, an exotic pavilion, quite unlike the soaring skyward towers of Gothic cathedrals. It served as the Doge's chapel, as well as Venice's state church. Consecrated in 1094 on the site of an older basilica, St. Mark's has a Byzantine-style front consisting of 5 portals surmounted by 5 arches, all decorated in light plateaus marbles and stones. 4 ancient horses cast in copper alloy reared above the porch. They may have come as booty from Venice's sacking of Constantinople in 1204. Above the horses, the building was capped by 5 domes. Inside, the cruciform nave church was gloomy in contrast with the exterior's light stone. But the interior was defined and lit by its ornate golden ceilings decorated with millions of shimmering mosaics. The novelty of St. Mark's encrusted mosaic tesserae attracted particular comment. Little stones and pieces of glass a quarter of the size of the nail of the little finger, as Jean de Tournai described them when he visited in 1488. Much of the mosaic work was made by Murano's famous glassworkers. St. Mark's Basilica was less a pilgrimage site, even though it claimed the body of the evangelist, and more a stage for the Venetian spectacle and the Doge's displays of power. At the Basilica in 1462, the English pilgrim William Way saw the ceremony of the Eve of St. Mark taking place, with 12 gold crowns full of precious jewels set on the saint's altar with extremely rich chalices, thuribles, and candlesticks. The high altar was made of gilded silver. For Way, the Basilica of St. Mark reminded him of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. On St. Mark's Day, he saw the city's fraternities parading around the church, holding wax candles in one hand and scourges in the other with which to beat themselves. The Irishman, Simon Fitzsimon, said St. Mark's was a most sumptuous church, built incomparably of marble and other valuable stones, and opposite stood the public square, St. Mark's Square, which, all things considered, has no equal anywhere. Conrad Grunenberg, visiting from Constance in 1486, described the basilica as such a marvel that it makes you wonder, overawed by the glass, gold, marble mosaics, and chandeliers. Adjacent to the basilica was the magnificent campanile, a belfry cum watchtower which dragged visitors' eyes skywards, its metallic-tipped spire like a welcoming star guiding arriving travellers. Such matters of faith aside, the main priority in Venice for most travellers was shopping for their journey ahead. The city was, by the 15th century, a kind of traveller's supermarket, geared towards making sure people were supplied for their arduous journeys. An Englishman, who can probably be identified as Geoffrey Caldwell of London, visited Venice in the late 15th century on his way to the Holy Land, and wrote a travel guide for others based on his experiences. His main concern was with what to buy, and his advice was that at Venice, first one must provide oneself with bedding and a cage for chickens. The birds themselves could be purchased along the route to Jaffa. Then, for the rest of his advice, Caldwell turned to what seems to have been a preoccupation for travellers, the management of one's bowels during the journey ahead. At Venice, Caldwell advised buying a covered pail for defecating and a urine jar. One should, he said, also obtain barrels of water and one's preferred wine, adding that some clean water should always be added to one's wine. This, he warned, is because the water from cisterns along the route caused constipation, whereas fresh water could be harmfully laxative. He advised stocking up at Venice, at the grocer's market, but with the advice of a physician, with an enema kit. with suppositories, like a man's finger made of white soap or a fine tallow candle. The other crucial thing to buy was some fennel seed and aniseed to help with excessive farting. Modern travel writing often avoids covering the private life of the travellers, not so medieval travel writing, in which the intimacies and needs of the traveller's body were covered as much as care for their soul. Conrad Grunenberg advised that keeping one's stomach warm would aid daily evacuation and guard against diarrhea. For this reason, he said that many travellers bought underclothes at Venice made out of scarlatto, an expensive woolen cloth for which the city was famous. Visitors to Venice reported on the foods that one should buy there and store for the coming sea voyage, as ballast for the stomach. Twice-baked, ring-shaped pan biscotto was especially suitable for people going to sea because it lasted a long time. Sardines, anchovies, and eels were staple fish and were often preserved to make them last longer and travel better. Sturgeon was salted and smoked or made into a kind of salami, morona. Salt cod, bacala, eaten throughout Europe, was also common in Venice and popular with travellers for the journey ahead. Galleys were expected to provide daily hot meals to passengers, though the quality was unpredictable. Travellers planned to use their own stores of food, topping them up at the ports they visited along the way. The food of Venice reflected the ingredients that came to the city from around the known world and the ability of its population to consume. The merchandise available there was the cause of most visitors' excitement. Pero Tafur marvelled that Spanish fruit was as cheap in Venice as in Spain, and added that in Venice one could buy whatever comes from Syria and, if one desires it, from India, since the Venetians navigate all over the world. Venice offered the visitor a global marketplace. Pietro Casola devoted pages to describing Venice's markets, asking, "Who could count the many shops so well furnished that they seem like warehouses?" He saw an extraordinary range of cloths, tapestries, brocades, hangings, carpets, silks of every kind, and many warehouses filled with spices, groceries, and drugs, and so much beautiful white wax. He said that this plenty could stupefy the beholder and defied being fully described. For Casola, such material abundance was a vision of enchanting beauty. He was delighted by Venice's bakeries, countless and of incredible beauty, selling unrivaled bread that made a sated man want to continue eating. Grain was imported to the city from the Middle East, and dough makers and bakers became well regulated. The weight and price of bread was fixed daily, and the products reflected travellers' needs. Casola loved the abundance of edible, if pricey, birds and fish, the copiousness of fruits and vegetables. It seemed as if all the gardens of the world must be there. And the almost incredible wines, Momzi, Muscatel, Greek wines, white wines, red wines, demijohns, and barrels in such bounty. Casola's account read as if he were drunk on the city itself. The one thing Casola was upset by was the miserable state of the meat market in the Rialto, and it put him off buying there. Such bad smells, such as putrefying entrails and rotting butcher's garbage, were indelibly connected to plague and illness. As a city constantly refilling itself with people on the move, Venice was particularly susceptible to contagions and plagues. Pero Tafur noted the cleanliness of the streets rinsed by the lagoon's waters, and added that the Venetians burned perfumes in the streets, and the people carry with them scents and spices which are ground in the streets and give forth a most pleasant smell. A pleasantly scented street equated to a healthy cityscape, and masked the foul vapours that threatened to arrive in the city with its throngs of visitors. Venice's canals, hemmed with narrow alleyways, were peopled with variety, of strangers imagining a million things about one another. The Jewish inhabitants were not yet confined to the ghetto. Turkish merchants traded with the city's businesses, and Moors from North Africa moved through the markets. Unmarried young women entered the convents and smuggled their lovers, male and female, into the cloisters. Prostitutes of all ages, genders, and types of beauty worked throughout the city. Inns and taverns were prohibited from letting prostitutes work there, and instead, from 1358, licensed brothels were established first near the Rialto, but eventually throughout the city. Venice's Greater Council decreed in 1360 that prostitutes were absolutely necessary in this town. By 1600, all these groups would be regulated in city institutions to contain them through civic care, as if to stem the constant movement of people around Venice's hospitable lagoon. In 1348, as the plague spread across Europe, the Greater Council of Venice hired night watchmen to check on incoming travellers who were suspected of bringing the sickness to the city. Venice, as a travel hub, could not help but be visited by the plague. So the city proactively developed lazzaretti in the lagoon, quarantine islands in which to enclose diseased people, or people deemed likely to be diseased. The quarantining of ill people in Venice's lazzaretti was a foreshadowing of the later Venetian habit of enclosing people so as to cleanse the city's body politic. Quarantine, from the medieval Latin and Venetian quarantena, referred to the 40 days and nights Jesus fasted in the desert, Matthew chapter 4, verse 2. Mount Quarantine, near Jericho, the purported site of Jesus' isolation and temptation by the devil, was frequently visited by Western pilgrims. The word quarantine entered French and Italian dialects in the 14th century to refer to a state of isolation for the purposes of public health. In 1377, Venice's former possession of Ragusa, Dubrovnik, across the Adriatic Sea, had started to quarantine incoming ships, holding them for 1 month at an uninhabited island, Macan, at a distance from Dubrovnik's thriving port. But it was in Venice that the world's first lazzaretto, or plague hospital, was established, on the island of Santa Maria de Nazareth in 1423. A second island, the Lazzaretto Nuovo, was established as a quarantine station in 1456 and fully operational by 1471. The idea of the isolation island quickly caught on, with lazzaretti being established at other key travellers' way stations around this time, including at Venice's neighbours and colonies in Padua, Chioggia, Split, and Corfu. The Venetian lazzaretti were used for individuals already sick with the pestilence, for people who had come into contact with the sick, for the cargoes and crews of incoming ships to be put into isolation before reaching the city, and for those convalescing from the plague. The lazzaretti were not always thought of as hellscapes of the condemned. People sometimes described them as paradise, a walled garden, sometimes as Cucagna, the land of cocaine, the mythical world of plenty, sometimes as a purgatory from which one would emerge cleansed. Butterflies thrived there, and white egrets waded assertively through the marshy waters. The air on the lazzaretti was heavy with the purifying scents of smouldering juniper and rosemary. This was to counter the rotten, sticky miasmas by which plague was thought to enter the body and unbalance the humours with too much heat and humidity. The Lazzaretto Vecchio is a tiny island nearly 3 kilometres to the east of St. Mark's Square, close to Lido, the sandbank that shelters Venice. Visitors to it were met by the walled buildings of a former monastery, including a cloister, a well, and a chapel. There were gardens with fruit trees and the prior's house set apart from the quarters for the sick, and warehouse areas for the disinfection of merchandise. The patients, many of them pilgrims, mariners, and merchants from across Europe and the Levant, were cared for in single-sex dormitories. Rich and poor sweated, groaned, and expired side by side. The wretched invalids were fed on foods considered restorative and healthy: hard-boiled eggs, chicken, veal, saffron, and wine. During an outbreak of plague, the galleys alongside St. Mark's Square were replaced by makeshift rafts. Those painted black conveyed away from the city the poxy corpses of those who had already succumbed. Boatmen, on the rafts chalked white to disinfect them, transported the sick to the lazzaretti. There, individuals who had been instructed to bring nothing but their bedding were registered by officials of the health board. Unlike other medieval healthcare, in Venice this was a civic and state-funded institution rather than a religious one. Signs of the extent of their illness were recorded, and those who seemed very unwell were given confession to prepare them for death. Foreign ambassadors and diplomats, Turkish and Jewish merchants, and transient pilgrims were all sent to the Lazzaretto alongside thousands of Venetians, many of them never to leave. The main feature of the Lazzaretti was their burial grounds. Thousands of corpses were put in long parallel trenches or sometimes in mass graves, body piled upon body. Graves were rarely marked. Investigation of skeletons from the Lazzaretto Vecchio shows that people died there from the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the travelling pathogen that causes bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague. There were at least 16 major eruptions of the plague in Venice between 1347 and 1528. In other words, the plague made a significant visit to the city roughly every decade. At each outbreak, the pestilence seemed to tear wildly through this place built for mobility. Plagues were disastrous for the population of such a densely packed city. In some plague years, a quarter to a third of Venice's population perished. At each outbreak, ascetic flagellant groups would parade through the afflicted city, whipping their backs in vehement rhythm, their blood weeping across the streets and into the canals as they signalled their abject humility before God. There was a Venetian confraternity founded in 1478 and dedicated to St. Roch, Rocco, for those afflicted with plague. In 1485, St. Roch's finger was brought from Germany to Venice to help give protection to the city. The rest of the saint's body followed a few years later. Roch himself had been an early traveller, a Frenchman who gave all his riches to the poor and set off as a penniless pilgrim to Rome. In Italy, he was said to have tended the sick during an outbreak of plague and to have been the cause of numerous miraculous healings. When Roch himself developed the illness, he was tended by a loyal dog who licked and healed his sores. Roch is often depicted in a pilgrim's garb, drawing back his gown to point at or to finger his pustular thigh. The Venetian church of St. Roch was sometimes visited by travellers when their companions had contracted the plague. In 1483, Felix Fabri, believing the landlord of his Venetian inn to have died of plague, hurried to St. Roch to offer prayers. Fabri's companions, meanwhile, had already headed west to Padua, fleeing Venice's vapours. From Venice, merchants could take a boat to all ports in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Pilgrims in general headed south by land to Rome or took a boat east to Jaffa for Jerusalem. Dame Beatrice Luttrell in 1350 chose Rome as her destination because it was the year of the Jubilee. The Rome Jubilee was essentially a festival of pilgrimage, an opportunity for any Christian devout enough to make the journey to prepare their soul for a future of spiritual purity. The Church had recognized that the Great Plague, which gripped Europe in 1347 and for several years afterwards, had given a newfound urgency to pilgrimage. The devout wanted to demonstrate their repentance and to give thanks for their emergence from the terrible pandemic. When Dame Beatrice reached Rome, she, her maid Joan, and her groom Henry would all have received plenary absolution for their sins. In other words, through travel, a lifetime's sinfulness could be expunged. Rome at this time was not a large city. After the plague, its falling population was around 17,000 people. Its rickety streets were visited for the tumble-down churches containing the bodies of the saints. Many of the city's classical ruins were ignored or were marooned outside the medieval town, which was much smaller than the ancient imperial capital. Aristocratic palaces and papal houses and merchants' compounds and new basilicas came and went in the city. Some antique remains were understood as strange marvels, like the giant first-century bronze pine cone which stood in the courtyard at Old St. Peter's, or the ingeniously round church of the Pantheon, called St. Mary Rotunda, with its massive dome that defied human understanding. John Capgrave, writing in 1450, repeated a common myth in his travel guide that the dome of the Pantheon, a marvel without pillars, had been built by constructing a giant mound of earth full of money. The dome was built over the hill, and then the townspeople were invited to take the earth away and keep the money they found as payment for their labour. The history of Rome was indivisible from its bishop, the Pope, with his great riches in part derived from property and taxation. He had the trappings of a king rather than a monk, although from 1309 to 1376 the popes did not reside in Rome and had abandoned the Lateran Palace, for long the main papal residence, in favour of Avignon. After touring the various altars around Rome, the culmination of the journey for a pilgrim like Dame Beatrice would have been a visit to two major basilicas, St. Paul's outside the walls and St. Peter's at the Vatican. These were obligatory, unmissable stations for any pilgrim wishing to receive the plenary indulgence and gain the full blessings of a pilgrimage to Rome. The other major sanctuary, St. John Lateran, on the Caelian Hill, overlooking the Colosseum, was at this point a wrecked building site after a catastrophic fire in 1308. The vast arcaded basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls on the city's outskirts had great bronze doors made in Byzantium showing scenes from the life of Christ and the lives of the saints, their names carved out in sinuous Greek lettering. Its nave led to a transept above the crypt where St. Paul's body was entombed. The shrine above the altar took the form of a splendid pinnacled canopy, designed by Arnolfo de Cambio and his friend Petrus in the 1280s, made of dark porphyry and solid gold. It combined architecture and delicate painting to resemble a decorated cathedral in miniature, a church within a church, with vaulting and rose windows and pointed arches, all soaring up from St. Paul's tomb. Below, pilgrims stepped down to a crypt to visit St. Paul's body. In contrast to the highly decorated finery above, there was an austere, simple and ancient slab with the name of the martyr apostle scratched into it. Holes had been cut in this slab. Pilgrims put pieces of cloth or other object into these holes to touch the holy remains, and the travellers and their rags would themselves thereby become contact relics via which the blessings of the saints could travel onwards. There was also a life-size wooden statue of St. Paul, his face serene. But his arms and legs were hacked into a sheared lump by pilgrims who scratched at the wood, taking splinters and wood chips, each one a relic of their proximity to St. Paul's body. Outside the church was a cloister of astonishing beauty, made of white marble with twisted pillars bejewelled with distinctive cosmatesque decoration. Gold and maroon and white triangles tessellating in the most up-to-date mosaic work. Meanwhile, St. Peter's at the Vatican stood in an elevated position overlooking the ancient city. It was not yet the palatial papal seat that the Vatican would become. It only became the main residence after the papal return from Avignon in the late 14th century. St. Peter's was, however, the preeminent church in Rome in 1350 and would have been an enormously congested scene. Despite the recent and ongoing ravages of the Great Plague, people mixed freely and seemed impervious to worries about contagion. Indeed, people died crushed in the press of enthusiastic pilgrims who came from all over Europe. One could buy food, flasks of water and wine, clothes and tin pilgrims' badges at stores inside the church's atrium in front of the basilica's broad steps. The scene was noisy, not especially holy, and some of the odours were impious. The old Basilica of St. Peter, dedicated to the first ever pope, was ancient even in the 14th century. Its mosaics were by then almost 1,000 years old. The forlorn faces of Mary and long-dead saints and past popes gazed from the walls through delicate tessellated expressions. In the nave of the massive church built by the Emperor Constantine, the rich and vivid decoration that had been accrued there over the centuries would have awed visitors like Dame Beatrice. One of the altarpieces, an imposing and sumptuous double-sided triptych, was painted by Giotto around 1320, 3 arches covered in gold and delicate pink and blue paints. At the centre of the triptych's front was St. Peter in majesty, surrounded by angels. To his right, the auburn-haired Cardinal Giacomo Gaetini Stefaneschi, died 1343, offers the saint a model of the triptych, and to his left, a bishop-pope offers Peter a book. The 2 kneeling figures demonstrated for pilgrims a powerful, recent and luxurious image of the virtue of making donations to St. Peter's community in Rome. The main apse featured a mosaic installed in the 13th century of Christ enthroned between Peter and Paul, with a procession of lambs converging on the throne. Watching this scene was the personification of Ecclesia, crowned with an imperial tiara, a bold statement of the primacy of the Church over any political or national unit. In the side aisles, sacred enamel statuettes of Christ and his apostles stood watch over penitent pilgrims confessing their sins to priests. As they lined up to be shriven, many of the pilgrims caressed and kissed the statues, almost lasciviously. A beautifully lifelike and many said ancient statue of St. Peter sat in the nave, and pilgrims fondled and wept over the statue's feet as if its bronze was the skin of a living man. Dame Beatrice would have prayed at various altars around St. Peter's, but the most important one would have been the shrine of the ancient kerchief of St. Veronica, a scrap of cloth bearing the imprint of Christ's face, held in a square frame behind thick glass. It was like the linen rags the visitors had in their own luggage, but imprinted with a holy visage staring out. Veronica, a Jerusalemite lady, was said to have wiped Christ's sweating face in his agony as he was forced on his way to Calvary. This cloth, called the vernicle, vera icon, or sudarium, sweat cloth, is one of the original contact relics. Pilgrims thronged around the vernicle, gazing on it in wonder. The vernicle gazed back as if Christ himself was looking into the visitor's eyes. Almost nothing of the St. Peter's of 1350 remains in situ, as the church was comprehensively demolished to be rebuilt around 1505. Even in the eternal city, change is constant. Dame Beatrice Luttrell's visit to St. Peter's was complete. Ideally, her journey would have left her refreshed and transformed, even if the travelling had been an ordeal. And then it was time for her and her party to head northwards, back to her English world of sad plenty. At this time, Rome, along with the Gallican city of Santiago de Compostela, was successfully competing with Jerusalem as the main destination for pilgrims. Detailed guidebooks were available for each place, listing practical and religious sites of interest. There were prestigious relics and an infrastructure to support travellers. Jerusalem was distant, expensive to get to, and governed by non-Christians, but was still the best pilgrimage one could make. In some places it was the only journey for which a wife did not need her husband's permission. So the most popular and desirable journey remained the sea crossing from Venice to Jaffa, the port of Jerusalem. And that is the route we now follow. Indulge yourself. An indulgence, or pardon, was one of the main reasons Christians travelled in medieval Europe. An indulgence granted after death, that one's time in purgatory due to sins committed during one's life would be remitted, shortened, or revoked. Indulgences were usually associated with travel to a saint's shrine or a holy place, and pilgrims would pay the church or its brokers for certificates of indulgence. Here is a small selection of the indulgences available in Rome for visitors in 1450, taken from a Rome travel guide. St. Peter's in the Vatican, San Pietro in Vaticano. 28 years at each of the 88 altars on the relevant saint's feast day, plus 7 years at the 7 most important altars. 1,000 years on Feast of the Annunciation, 1,000 years on Maundy Thursday, 1,000 years on St. Peter's feast day, 7,000 years and remission from a third of all sins on anniversary of church's dedication. When the vernicle, cloth of St. Veronica, is shown, 3,000 years to Romans, 9,000 years for those from between Rome and the Alps, and 12,000 years for those from beyond the Alps. St. John Lateran, San Giovanni in Laterano. Full remission of sins for all those who enter the chapel of St. John the Baptist, men only. Women can get the indulgence if they touch the door. St. Paul's outside the walls, San Paolo fuori le mura, 28 years with remission from a third of one's sins for entering the church via the west door, near the relic of St. Paul's head. 1,000 years on St. Paul's feast day, 100 years on the feast day of St. Paul's conversion, 40 years on the feast day of the Holy Innocents, 7,000 years with remission from a third of one's sins on the feast day of the dedication of the church. Every Sunday, one receives the same pardon as if one went to Santiago de Compostela. St. Lawrence outside the walls, San Lorenzo fuori le mura. 7 years of pardon, 7 Lents, and remission of a third of all sins. 100 years on the feast days of St. Lawrence and Stephen. Anyone who visits this church on a Wednesday can deliver a soul from purgatory. 5. Across the Great Sea, from Venice to Cyprus. At sea, Zadar, Modon, Rhodes, Cyprus. Travellers boarding a ship at Venice for the Holy Land could expect a journey of between 25 and 60 days until they reached the ancient harbour at Jaffa. It could take much longer than this, but this was no leisurely pleasure cruise around Mediterranean beauty spots. Hazards were many: weather, piracy, delays to pick up and unload cargo, onboard plague and sickness, being shipwrecked on some alien shore, or being ripped off by a crooked padrone, the ship's patron. The shipping route between Venice and Jaffa was an industry in itself, serving pilgrims to the Holy Land while connecting Venice with its empire of islands and trading posts in the eastern Mediterranean. The key ports of Pola, Zadar, and Durrës, and settlements in and around Greece, such as Corfu, Modon, Methoni, Euboea, Heraklion, and Cyprus, were all Venetian possessions at some point in the later Middle Ages. The ocean waxed with the moon. The sea's waters were sometimes green, sometimes blue, now troubled, now serene, studded with rocks and crags and sandbanks, even whirlpools. The sea was understood to cleanse itself by its constant motion and to cast out any corruption or dead thing, as many wise men had observed. But it also caused dread and fear and could suddenly be transformed by a raging squall. The much-quoted scholar and encyclopedist Isidore of Seville, died 636, described the sea's distinctive quality of fretum, a kind of turmoil in the waves, a fervent and strong motion with a unique power to drown men and swallow ships. The sailors had to trust in the stars and the position of the sun, and in their compass and in their brass and silver mariner's astrolabe, a little device with a rule tracing one's position across an engraved map of the stars. Even then, the air around the sea could turn violent and throw any vessel around, or the atmosphere could grow dim and misty, leading a ship into unknown perils. The most common kind of boat taken by travellers was the Venetian galley, a long, slender, shallow vessel propelled by oarsmen. A pilgrim galley leaving Venice for the spring voyage, usually departing around early June, had a crew of several hundred men, including about 200 oarsmen. The Milanese churchman Pietro Cassola, who made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1494, travelled on a galley from Venice with 170 other pilgrims. The galley was commanded by a sopracomito, a kind of captain, and the crew and passengers were looked after by the powerful and important patron. Daily life on board a galley was, by contemporary accounts, grim. Every galley was obliged to have a cat on board to help manage the vermin breeding and scurrying around the decks. If one's goods were damaged by rats because of the lack of a cat, one could sue the shipping company. Hans von Mergenthal, a German pilgrim from Venice to Jerusalem in 1476, described how rats on board could wander over one's body during the night. William Way, who travelled from Venice to Jaffa in both 1458 and 1462, suggested getting to know the ship's patron to avoid having to stay in the boat's smoulderingly hot and stinking lower quarters. Wealthy passengers could hire cabin space in the forecastle, the raised deck above the ship's bow. Here, isolation from most of the other passengers and fresher air made for a relatively dignified experience. Jewish travellers were recommended to get their own cabin to avoid harassment from the ship's crew. Humbler passengers stayed below deck, while the poorest lodged in the bilge below the waterline, alongside the ballast. This was a dark, filthy space, shared with freight and mariners and innumerable crawling things, a cavity that reeked of food and vomited meals, sweaty bodies, and sleeplessness. Fellow travellers were pressed together here from all over the world, groaning and belching, united in abjection. The boat itself had to be well made, well maintained, and manned by a skillful steersman. A lazy or careless shipmaster could cause even the most well-appointed galley to run aground. Very few people were able to swim if they fell into the sea. At each port, the passengers' transition from the galley to a small skiff or tender in order to go ashore was a moment of great jeopardy, especially if there was anything more than a breeze. If one missed one's footing between galley and tender, one was certain to perish in the waves. The Florentine Simone Segoli, reflecting on his journey to Jerusalem in 1384, seemed to summarize the medieval attitude to sea travel. No one should travel who does not desire hardship, trouble, tribulation, and the risk of death. Traveller's wisdom. The ninth wave in a series of waves is always the strongest. The ninth wave might bury a ship. The force of this fatal wave can only be broken with a prayer. Nicola de Martoni, an Italian pilgrim to Jerusalem in 1395, found that the terror of his boat capsizing in the eastern Mediterranean caused his hair and beard suddenly to turn white. The Castilian diplomat, Ruy González de Clavijo, found his carrack caught in a dreadful storm near the volcanic island of Stromboli in July 1403. The wind blew the boat back on itself, and the sails from stem to stern were split, so the carrack had to endure the storm with bare poles. The ship's captain came to his passengers and crew and asked for litanies to be chanted, imploring the mercy of God. As the carrack rode out the storm, flickering lights like candles appeared about the boat's limbs. These lights were accompanied by voices as the storm howled. These were, said Clavijo, the sign of St. Pedro González Telmo, died 1246, the saviour of storm-tossed mariners. Clavijo's is an early account of the weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, in which luminous glows and buzzing sounds appear in an atmospheric electrical field. It was held to be a good omen that the saint was providing succour to the frightened sailors. The terrifying storm was followed by a period of calm. Whereas weather was unpredictable, seasickness was an entirely foreseeable traveller's peril. The sea caused violent reactions that could knock an otherwise indefatigable person out. The French poet Guillaume de Machaut, 1300 to 1377, wrote about the dire seasickness of Peter I, died 1369, king of Cyprus and Jerusalem. And so at sea he spent the whole time flat under his quilt, just like a corpse, no food, no drink, no sleep. Medieval medical handbooks often gave useful advice on how to deal with seasickness. The popular Compendium of Medicine by Gilbert the Englishman, circa 1230 to 1260, issued a prescription for preventing nausea at sea. One should fast or eat bitter fruit like quinces, pomegranates, and oranges. One could try drinking an aniseed or chervil concentrate on an empty stomach. Gilbert also recommended that sea travellers sit upright and firmly hold the ship's beams, that they avoid looking around and move their head only with the ship's motion. Finally, he recommended sucking sweets or eating seeds to produce belching. Marjorie Kemp gave a vivid account of seasickness during her voyages of the early 1430s. Sailing on the Baltic between Gdansk and Stralsund, she felt wretched and terrified on account of the waves. But God spoke to her and comforted her with some sensible and timeless advice. He told her, in her soul, to lay down her head and to avoid looking at the waves. A short time later, crossing the English Channel from Calais to Dover, Kemp prayed to God to maintain her dignity during a rough sea passage and give her the grace to hold her head up and keep her from vomiting filthy matter in the presence of her fellow travellers. Not only did her God protect her, but everyone else on the boat suffered from atrocious seasickness, vomiting and throwing up very violently and filthily. None more so than another Englishwoman who had previously slighted Kemp. Seasickness was a bitter revenge indeed. The Mediterranean is a sea of small tides and mostly gentle currents. The sailors that traversed it depended on the whimsical winds. Yet there was one thing seaborne travellers dreaded above seasickness or violent storms or raging surges or freakish tides: a period of dead calm. A dead calm, called a bonaccia by the Venetian mariners, meant that the traveller travelled no further. Perhaps the worst thing for any traveller is to be forced to an involuntary halt. In a dead calm, the sea would stop, halted in stupid tranquillity, smooth, dulled. Boats languished, blocked, unnervingly steady. Even the teams of oarsmen couldn't propel the boat in such leaden seas. Dust seemed to gather around the useless frippery of the sails and on the static hawsers. The very sea had become an anchor. The astrolabe remained still, as if jammed. The shipmen lazed on the deck, making music on their bagpipes or zithers, or playing improvised games of ninepins, or sometimes trick-tack and checkers with the captain's staghorn game pieces. The stark vacuum of boredom threatened. Motionlessness, paralysis. The Italian nobleman, Roberto da San Severino, was stuck in a dead calm in the winter of 1458 for a period of 22 days. His boat sat, stultified, off the island of Sapienza in the Peloponnese, causing a significant delay to his return to Venice. Traversing the oceans has long involved traversing the monotony of oneself. Felix Fabry, who had little positive to say about sea travel, wrote that a period of dead calm was more distressing to sea travellers than anything but an actual shipwreck. He described how in the calm, the entire boat and everything on it seemed to putrefy and rot. Wine became undrinkable, the dried smoked meat bulged with maggots, and innumerable flies, gnats, fleas, lice, worms, mice and rats suddenly sprang to life. The people on board lost their tempers, growing lazy, sleepy, and even more unkempt. Melancholy, anger, and envy spread everywhere among the boat's passengers. The only thing the mariners could do was to wait, or try to kedge the boat, fastening the vessel to an anchor with a cable and hauling it out of the ponderous calms. Death at sea was also common. In 1446, the English ship the Cog Ann was wrecked on the rocks of Modon in southern Greece. It was carrying about 160 pilgrims, together with sacks of wool for export. The boat had sailed from King Road, the port of Bristol, via the Straits of Gibraltar and Seville. In the tempestuous darkness of a December night, the Cog Ann was driven onto the rocks. 37 crew and passengers drowned. The Bishop of Modon gave them what he considered to be an honourable Christian burial and consecrated an oratory to their special memory. In just over 2 weeks, in September to October 1518, the galley carrying Jacques Lesage of the French city of Douai from Cyprus to Rhodes became infested with sickness. At least 7 passengers died, and others considered too ill to continue sailing were left at Rhodes, in the care of the Knights Hospitaller. Felix Fabry remarked acidly that, as the privations of the journey took their toll on the travellers, his galley on the return journey from Jaffa to Venice came to resemble a hospital. There was an ambivalence about such a death, as perishing on a pilgrimage was thought to bring its own special blessings. If pilgrimage was a kind of travelling purgatory, a cleansing of one's soul, then death near Jerusalem was a fast track to heaven. A popular medieval preacher's story told how a boatload of pilgrims returning from Jerusalem sank. The pilgrims' corpses washed ashore all marked with crosses, as if blessed forever in their martyrdom by travel. Some travellers uttered special prayers for seafaring, and special liturgies were developed for sea passengers in danger. People lit candles and prayed to seafaring saints like St. Nicholas of Bari or the Magdalene of Marseille or St. James of Compostela. Others carried an effigy of St. Christopher, patron saint of wayfarers. Where shipwrecked sailors had been saved, new and often transient altars appeared on coastlines, their candles flickering out to the dark seas. These guided ships' pilots to safety and blessed their passengers' journeys. At the coastal town of Pola, an icon of the Virgin Mary was worshipped by visitors. It was said to have appeared inside a fig tree one day during an outbreak of plague. The Virgin's very name, Maria, seemed to be a benediction of the plural seas, Maria. With this perilous passage ahead of them, the galleys sailing from Venice made their way southeast through the Adriatic Sea, through gentle waters on a predictable route cleaving to Istrian and Dalmatian coasts. They passed numerous ports and stopped at many of them. The Venetian winged lion carved in stone repeatedly greeted the travellers along the coast, a sign of familiarity and an assurance of good order, even if the air in these coastal towns tended to have a not entirely wholesome scent of pine resin, wild garlic, and excrement. At each way station, people would come to greet the boat, selling local produce and encouraging the travellers to visit their town's shrines. Conrad Grunenberg is a representative and very informative traveller about the onward sea voyage from Venice through the Adriatic. Grunenberg, who had a good education and plenty of money, had been the officer in charge of the mint in the city of Constance. In his 60s, he set off from Constance for Jerusalem, taking a galley at Venice for a sum of 38 ducats, half to be paid on the spot, the other half to be paid on successfully arriving in the Holy Land. He wrote a detailed, illustrated, and often garrulous account of the strange, beautiful, and wonderful things he saw on his journey, which took place over 31 weeks, from April to November 1486. He described himself and his fellow travellers as insatiable learners of foreign and strange customs. While he was not exactly tolerant, he was certainly interested in the diversity of peoples he encountered. As his galley left Venice, Grunenberg listened to travellers entertain each other with stories about Venice and its Dalmatian towns. His boat collected cattle, sheep, and goats at Pirano and continued to Parenzo, Rovigno, and Pola. He lingered at the large and beautiful town of Sara, Zadar, the main city of Sclavonia, Slavonia, a miniature eastern Venice. He was told about its famous relic of St. Simeon's body resting in a magnificent church with a tower built like lace. Since around 1204, when the saint's body had been brought to Zadar from Constantinople, Simeon's tomb was the city's biggest draw. A giant cedarwood chest made in the late 1370s, decorated with finely worked silver plaques depicting the saint's life and miracles, including the moment when Simeon took the infant Jesus in his arms and presented him in the temple in Jerusalem. The reliefs also showed a more contemporary scene of a boat in a storm, bringing Simeon's relics to Zadar, with high waves threatening to overwhelm the vessel and desperate manners jettisoning bundles of merchandise into the sea. Terrified passengers are shown huddling in the centre of the ship. It would have been a scene that connected Simeon's cult with the experience of visitors to his shrine. Inside the chest, Simeon's mummified body, miraculously uncorrupted, was shown to pilgrims. An African ostrich egg had been hung above the tomb as a symbol of good luck and to represent the globe of planet Earth. At Zadar were also the body parts of St. George, skull, St. John the Baptist, finger, St. Chrysogonus, blood-stained chemise, and Mary Magdalene, skull, and a grubby stub of the sponge from which Christ was offered gall at Calvary. But Grunenberg was also fascinated by an idol that had been worshipped there. He described a tall column hewn from a single block of stone topped by a griffin. He was told that the griffin had been worshipped for many years and performed miracles and addressed the townspeople. When the people converted to Christianity, they attached a plaque with crosses to it. The moment the crosses touched it, the column split asunder from top to bottom, and the evil spirit of the idol fled from it. This arresting story shows Grunenberg's incipient curiosity about the non-Christian environments and intriguing histories he was encountering. He was reckoning with Zadar's pagan history, as he was describing the Pillar of Shame, once part of the Roman Forum and used as a place of public punishment in the Middle Ages. It is indeed topped with a kind of griffin, a winged beast, a pagan forerunner of the Venetian winged lion of St. Mark. It was a warning that all empires come and go. Grunenberg's interest in the column discloses implicitly a comparison between the bodies of the saints claimed by Zadar and the city's pre-Christian idols. Travel caused him to ponder the differences between a relic and a magic charm, a prayer and a spell, an icon and an idol. Grunenberg's travels through Dalmatia read something like an account of a modern holiday, beautiful buildings, strange and interesting churches, and encounters with charming, colourful locals. Venetian governors welcomed him with delicious dishes and pastries. At Zadar he witnessed a wedding, admiring the bride's golden crowns set with precious stones, and all the ribbons and ornaments of the women. Oat, owned wheat, and barley were thrown over the married couple, symbolizing the future plenty the bride and her children would enjoy. Grunenberg entered the church to watch the marriage ceremony in the Slavonic manner, noting the priest's odd gestures, the men coming forward to kiss the cross, the women kissing a painting of the Virgin, and everyone holding a burning candle throughout. Strikingly handsome women were observed, and the local customs of Hungarians, Slavs, Turks, Greeks, and Italians were noted, as Grunenberg, in some awe, noted a great diversity in dress and a great variety of languages. His galley, as long as the weather was fine, seemed to have an atmosphere of a party cruise. On the 23rd of June, the eve of the Feast of St. John, there were special entertainments on board ship. The mariners put 50 lanterns around the boat, fired their weapons into the air, and blew their trumpets while a drummer rolled his drum. The gallio, the galley's oarsmen, sang songs and danced gaily with each other around the decks. Everything seemed to be going well, apart from a growing anxiety about the proximity of the Turks, who, according to Grunenberg, mistreated their horses terribly, demanded tribute off the Christians to keep the peace, and forced the people of towns like Zadar and Dubrovnik to worry constantly about being besieged. As the ship headed southeast, the coastline grew challenging in its alloy of familiar with unfamiliar. Passengers saw broken vestiges of ancient pillars and strange temples on desolate beaches, and wretched-looking villages amid melancholy woods and wild stone spires. Fingerish islands, little larger than a marketplace and scarcely inhabited, passed by. The travellers from Venice weren't sure who lived in these places. Were the people pious sages, or were they infidels? It was hard to tell. South of Dalmatia, after Corfu, the travellers passed alongside the region they called Romania, the southern Balkans. On the port side, the passengers might have gazed on Turkish territories such as Achaia in the Peloponnese area of Greece, taken by the Ottomans in 1460, where mosques dotted the skyline, new fortresses were being built, and veiled ladies could be seen walking near the shore. At starboard, they might have seen perpendicular churches that would not have looked out of place in Sicily or Spain, and campaniles that recalled Italian towns. The travellers looked forward to reaching the Venetian town of Modon, a walled port said to be exactly halfway between Venice and Jaffa. Modon was famous for its Rumney wine, literally wine of Romania, the Balkans, which sustained Mediterranean travellers for many centuries. At the midpoint of Modon, the air on terra firma was hot and dry, settling into an agitated silence on the fawn-coloured hillsides. Modon, built in sandy stone and encircled by walls and ditches, sat on a rock promontory with a shallow harbour on its eastern side. Windmills turned lazily on the western side of Modon's port, where several large boats were docked. Grisly black rocks lined the base of the city's walls, as if to deter unwanted invaders from trying to land. The whole town had a look of impregnability, strong, stark, self-contained. The main bastion had a pair of semicircular windows, like two silent eyes staring out to sea, behind which sat armed watchmen, vigilant always. The town had, along with the Morea, become part of the Venetian Empire in 1204 and was relentlessly fortified. It was a garrison for crusaders. The Venetians then developed Modon into a major trading port. Olive oil, wheat, honey, wax, figs, citrus fruit, cochineal, spicery, and salted carcasses flowed through its merchants' and mariners' hands to and from Alexandria, the Black Sea, and far beyond. Visitors to Modon would also be able to stock up on the area's famous raisins of Corinth, currants. Like French, raisin de Corinth, German, Corinthe, Russian, Korinka, Spanish, Pasa de Corinto, Swedish, Corinth. In Modon, the Venetian dignitaries ate of Catalan crockery, and drank from Chinese glassware, their meals salted, peppered, and saffroned with the world's best flavours. Modon and its nearby city of Coroni were known as Venice's Eastern Eyes. The towns were harried by the Turks throughout the later 15th century and taken by them in 1500. There are over 85 surviving accounts of Modon from between 1147 and 1533, and they reveal much about the ways in which travellers passed through the fraught and contested eastern Mediterranean littoral zone. As each boat from Venice arrived, the only people to be seen outside the walls were watermen on the harbour, dressed in grubby whites, employed to bring the weary travellers ashore in rowing boat tenders. Cats, many of which had their noses eaten away by some unfortunate circumstance, roamed the port, along with a few currish dogs. Some fly-bitten, fully laden mules were tethered there too. The galleys had to be skillfully steered into Modon's port. The water was shallow, with Black Sea rushes waving in it. Here a pier causeway reached out into the sea, a Venetian arm hugging boats towards Modon. This causeway, a hallmark of Venice's ports, led up to the sea gate of St. Mark, named after Venice's patron saint and embellished, of course, with the city's winged lion. Armoured men in the city's defence drew their swords in salute and shouted, "Viva Santo Marco!" Behind this gate, the tightly packed buildings and belfries of the town piled up on the slender isthmus. The town's walls and gates were marked with the escutcheons of the Venetian governors, many of whom were from Venice's leading families: Bembo, Canal, Corna, Foscolo, Miani, Morosini, Venier. Beyond the town walls, a scatter of huts spilled onto the hills where olive trees, ancient vines, and abundant fruit trees filled the landscape. Some tall cypresses stood marvellously still. Further beyond was a mountainous, wooded landscape spotted with unknowable villages. The whole town of Modon seemed perfect for the visiting voyager on first landing. There was a German inn, or Funduk, where visitors could get a good, familiar meal. Konrad Grunenberg ate here in a grapevine bower. There were bakeries geared to the travellers, serving delicious dry biscuits which they could put in their bags and take onwards with them. There was a grand marketplace, the Square of Arms, where men from the galleys could set up stalls and sell their wares and buy local goods. One could pay for everything in Venetian ducats and tornicelli, the colonial small coin used in Venice's empire. And there were even wonderful churches and shrines with the relics of the ancient martyr Saint Athanasius, 2 fingers of Saints Cosmas and Damian, and the entire body of a saint called Leo. Most of the travellers had never heard of this Saint Leo before, but he turned out to be, like them, a traveller. Leo had been a devoted pilgrim and ascetic, either Venetian or Calabrian, depending on who told his story. He had lived as a penniless beggar, a perfect pilgrim who travelled barefoot and was clad only in one scanty robe. He had died on his way to Jerusalem, or perhaps on his way back from Jerusalem, depending on who told his story, expiring when he saw the town of Modon in the distance, or when he set foot on its dock, depending on who told his story. Some said his death had happened in the distant past, in the time of the Crusades. But others, perplexingly, seemed to remember meeting him just a few years before, and they talked about him like he was an uncle or cousin who had died young. After his death, whenever that was, the Holy Leo had caused many miracles to happen among the Turks and unbelievers. He had been buried first on Modon's beach and then in the town's cathedral. He became revered locally as a patron saint of travellers and pilgrims. He was the ideal and convenient saint for visitors to Modon. The Venetian Senate ruled and regulated life inside Modon's walls, just as it did in Venice. In 1389, the Senate declared that Modon and Coroni were 2 very useful places for the Signoria, the supreme body of the Venetian Republic, and that it was especially important to ensure the proper maintenance of their ports and arsenals and the goods stored there. Hundreds of detailed surviving records show how Modon's Venetian governors tried to enforce the law. Nocturnal police patrolled the town. There were strict regulations about bribes and extortion in public office. There was constant vigilance over the nearby smaller ports of Navarino and Zonchio, Pylos, worries about Catalan and Flemish blockades, frequent reports of encroachments from the Genoese and Ottomans, contracts for the engagement of crossbowmen to defend the town. Monthly salary in 1403, 18 ducats, compared to 12 ducats for a ship's oarsman. And resolute enforcement over licensing, pricing, and tariffs on goods like flour and olive oil. The Venetian lion could see into every transaction and every crime of the townspeople and visitors. Medieval Modern existed, to a significant extent, to serve the Venetian galleys, but its Greek population did not become Venetian. Many visitors were surprised that Greek was the lingua franca and was used by the educated classes. Visiting Modern in June 1453, Peter Rott of Basel heard the devastating news that Constantinople had been conquered by the Turks and the Christian emperor murdered. Many travellers noted that the Turks were closing in on Modern. Roberto da San Severino in November 1458 found the town almost devoid of humans who had fled or succumbed to a great pestilence. Visiting for 2 days in August 1460, the Basel pilgrim Hans Bernhard von Eptingen was glad to find the excellent Rumney wine that was highly prized in his hometown, but was alarmed by reports of 100,000 Turks massing within 3 hours of Modern. Indeed, later that year, the Turks did take the Morea, the mainland to which Modern is attached. After a promising start, most visitors to medieval Modern began to express distaste and then revulsion towards the town. Travellers reported that its buildings were too close together and cheaply constructed, and that the city's cathedral was shabby. The priest who showed the relics seemed more an underhand cobbler than a venerable cleric. Even the box in which he kept the relics, once the travellers' eyes adjusted in the gloaming, was falling to pieces. The priests sang their liturgy enthusiastically, but in deep, unfamiliar tones, as if proclaiming personal misfortunes. The grasshoppers churring in the bushes grew incessant to the point of ridiculousness. There were few good lodgings for visitors, and the miserable friars didn't take in guests to their friary, so most travellers had to go back to the galley to rest at night, their sleep interrupted by the waves from which they had sought respite. Apart from the excellent wine and fruit, good food was scarce. Pietro Casola in 1494 found little comfort to be had. He could only obtain a few eggs, and even these he had to cook himself. Anselm Adornes, a Flemish-Genoese merchant and pilgrim from Bruges, observed a particularly striking incident when he briefly stopped at Modern in November 1470. At the port, a Turk was being executed by impalement, the Venetians running a pike through his body from fundament to face. Adornes was told that 2 years previously, this Turk had ridden at high speed towards the Venetian galleys, his horse panting and sweating. He had jumped down from his mount and shouted, "Accept me as a Christian." There and then, he slaughtered his exhausted horse, presumably as a sign of the sincerity of his commitment to remain in Modern. He lived outwardly as a perfect Christian for 2 years, all the time secretly gathering information about the Venetians and passing it back to the Turks. When this was found out, he was imprisoned. The allegations were investigated and verified, and the Turk eventually executed. We don't know the Turks' side of the story, but the further east the Western travellers went, the more stories of religious treachery they heard. Indeed, there were so many tales of renegades that it became hard to know friend from foe. The precariousness of Modern status, with the Ottoman Turks governing land just a few kilometres away, seemed to lead many travellers to experience human variety as repellent, concerning, and deeply undesirable. Most noteworthy for visitors from the mid-15th century were Modern's Jewish and gypsy communities, who had their own neighbourhoods in the suburbs, outside the town walls. Paul Wolter, visiting Modern from the southern German town of Güglingen in 1482-3, noted Modern's mixed population of Greeks, Gypsies, Moors, pagans, and Christians. Meshulam of Volterra, a Jewish pilgrim to Jerusalem, visited Modern in September 1481 and found over 300 Jewish households there, a considerable community. They were engaged in handicrafts and similar trades. Christian visitors tended to be less polite. Pietro Casola in 1491 founded the town's Jewish inhabitants to be filthy, very dirty people, full of bad smells. "Their society did not please me," he wrote, sniffily. Arnold von Harf, in the late 1490s, visited the Jewish community in their own long street. the women making silkwork and other haberdashery, some of which he bought. Meanwhile, Modon's Gyp community were part of the significant gypsy settlement in the Venetian colonies of the Peloponnese from at least the 1440s. This is the origin of their present-day name, Roma or Romani. Like the prized Rumney wine, they were of the province of Romania, the Morea or Peloponnese. They lived especially at the small Venetian port of Napoli di Romagna, Nafplio, northeast of Modon, but had a significant, if makeshift, settlement at Modon in the later 15th century. Conrad Grunenberg described about 300 huts made from reeds and loam in which lived gypsies, also called infidels over there. Philippe de Voisin, visiting in 1490, found all kinds of people living in the town, including Romani, whom he described as poor and living in wretched conditions. Jean de Cucarmois, visiting Modon also in 1490, said gypsies took their name not from Egypt, but from a village called Gypte. De Cucarmois was repeating what many travellers wondered. Where did these people come from? The Romani of Modon may well have wondered the same thing about the various travellers who stared at them and then sailed away. Many visitors commented on the Romani living beneath the town by the beach, where there was a makeshift settlement of huts in contrast to the stark stones of the fortified Venetian city. Arnold von Harff repeated a myth that they were from a country called Gyp or Segania, 60 kilometres from Modon. He described them as poor, black, naked people who had been refugees from the Turks who had occupied Gyp and then become vagabonds in the Venetians' midst. Is it ever acceptable for a traveller to be rude about the people they happen to encounter along their way? Travel writing is full of such spiteful assessments of other human beings. At Modon, many medieval travellers articulated a Christian, European judgmentalism, a supercilious and composting hatred that would become the hallmark of later Western tourists. A traveller reserves the right not to enjoy a place, but what right can a traveller possibly have to be disappointed in the people who dare to inhabit that place? The haughty comments of European travellers about the Jewish and Romani inhabitants of Modon suggest that, in the drama of the journey, these poor people were unscripted extras, as if a part of the stage set had fallen away to reveal an impromptu presence. By the time Sir Richard Guilford sailed past the Peloponnese on his way to Jerusalem in July 1506, Modon was no longer a Venetian Christian town. It had in 1500 been conquered by the Turks. The medieval fortifications survive, but the town was completely razed and is now in an eerie plain enclosed by elegant battlements. Guilford's galley did not stop in Modon for fear of the Turk. He knew that excellent wines were available in the town, but his boat continued to still Venetian Heraklion, Candia, on the island of Crete. Guilford missed out on Modon, but his interests were quickly piqued by the nearby island of Sirigo, or Cytherea, one of the places where Venus was said to have been born. The Byzantine shrines and bustling Venetian ports were one by one falling to the Turks. Along these shores of shifting powers there was one steadfast redoubt of Christendom, the island of Rhodes. Rhodes was controlled not by the Venetians, but by the Knights Hospitaller, who held sovereign control over the island and were organised as a military and political force. They were an order of devout men, committed to sacred travel. They existed to facilitate journeys to Jerusalem, and their name comes from their sponsorship and stewardship of the Pilgrims' Hospice in Jerusalem, the Muristan. The Knights Hospitaller had been expelled from the Holy Land in 1291 by the Mamluks, the Muslim military force who conquered much of the military East in the 13th century and effectively ended the Crusades in the Holy Land. The Knights then established a significant power base first in Cyprus and then ever more steadfastly in Rhodes. From Rhodes, they built a small empire of forcelets, towers and strongholds including the island of Castellorizzo and a mainland fort at Halicarnassus, Bodrum. The Hospitallers built impressive fortifications in the town of Rhodes, which held within them the magnificent Grand Master's palace. The Grand Masters were almost all French in origin, with occasional Italian and Aragonese holders of the title. They fought Barbary pirates and, in 1444, repelled a Mamluk invasion. The decades after 1453, when the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, saw increasingly effective Ottoman incursions in the Aegean islands, and in 1480, Rhodes was subject to a long Ottoman siege, which caused a significant panic across Christian Europe. Eventually, in 1523, the Ottomans conquered the island. After the failure of the Holy Land Crusades, Rhodes was perhaps the key frontier zone of Europe, a place ruled and inhabited by Western nobility as if it were a Burgundian estate, but within sight of the Turkish shore. Passing travellers were a crucial part of the Rhodian economy and the maintenance of hospitaller rule. Each part of Europe was represented within the organisation by a langue, a supranational group. Each langue had its own auberge at Rhodes: Aragonese, Auvergnat, Castilian and Portuguese, English, French, Italian and German. Each auberge was like a luxury hotel and medical centre for expatriate hospitallers and their guests. For less august visitors, in the mid-15th century, the hospitallers built a magnificent new pilgrims' hospital in the town of Rhodes. It contained a capacious infirmary ward, an airy space with natural light and between 30 and 40 canopied beds for unwell travellers, of whom there was an unending supply. Little booths were constructed behind the arcades where surgery could be performed and patients could recover or expire with some privacy. Mass was performed daily. Many hospitaller knights from all over Europe died there, far from home. Their tombs were decorated with coats of arms and devices that recalled their origins. The fraught status of Rhodes is exemplified by the account given by the perspicacious English traveller William Way on his journey to Jerusalem in 1458. At Rhodes, he was told about a recent event. 250 Turks had been brought to the island by sea and had been paraded through the town led by Christian boys who themselves had formerly been imprisoned by the Turks. The Turks were then tortured in a variety of spectacularly cruel ways, in a festival of violence. Some of the Turks were dragged by ropes attached to their pierced nostrils, others with their hands tied behind their backs. 18 Turkish prisoners were impaled with stakes driven through the anus all the way to their chests. 10 were dragged naked across a plank of iron spikes. 2 were baptized and then beheaded. 1 was flayed, his skin cut from his body. Another was tossed from a high tower and then strung up by his penis. The rest were hanged, some by the neck, some by the feet, their bodies placed on either side of the city so that they were in full view of all passers-by. Way seemed unsurprised by this kind of violence and commented that the Sultan of the Turks was at the time moving 30,000 men, women and children from the Morea to populate the recently conquered Constantinople. On a more usual day, as the pilgrim galleys sailed from Rhodes to Cyprus, the passengers passed the time by telling stories or preaching sermons or singing songs. The mariners and their passengers saw bricks and walls submerged in the shallows of the clear seawater. A well-known story about the area went like this. Not far from Rhodes, near the shore, were the sunken ruins of an ancient city known as Catalia, or Satalia, or Adalia, or Antalya. No one was quite sure of its name. It was said to have been a wonderful city full of splendid buildings and happy citizens. It had been the centre of a great empire which controlled the lands and the seas thereabouts. But all this territory was lost through the folly of one young man. This man loved a beautiful woman, so much so that it was as if his heart had been set on fire. Yet the young woman suddenly died of the plague. Her lovely body was placed in a finely wrought marble tomb. The young man's heart was broken. He sickened and languished and still remained in love with the young woman. Each night, and sometimes during the day, he was aroused by the thought of her. One night, he went to her tomb, opened it, and crept inside where he had sex with her corpse. And then he left. In the weeks and months that followed, he started to forget about her. Suddenly, one evening, after 9 months, the young man heard a voice bellowing clear as day, "Go to that woman's tomb, open it, and see what you created. And if you don't go, you'll be grievously harmed." So the young man went back to the tomb, and as he approached, he remembered what he had done last time he was here, but felt not a speck of desire for his former lover. He opened up the tomb. Suddenly, a dreadful, hideous-looking dragon's head shot out, screaming and screeching, before flying around the city and over the land. As it soared off into the mountains, a great wave rose from the sea, and the whole city was submerged. The water swept the people away and drowned the buildings. We assume the young man died in the deluge. Ever since then, the sea crossings between Rhodes and Cyprus had become perilous because of the sunken city and the strange undercurrents and unfathomable abysses, all caused by the sinful youth and his terrible actions. This story, which was told throughout Europe, rebuked those travellers whose thoughts, through boredom, lust, or impiety, had wandered to impure places. And the story also reminded them that terrain could rise and fall, whole cities could be sunken, coasts could come and go. They might have reflected on the flood that God sent to Noah to cleanse the corrupt earth, or the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that were laid waste and remained ever barren thanks to vice. Some may have heard tell of the fiendish tidal waves in 1303 that overwhelmed Crete and swept buildings and people away in Alexandria and Acre. It happened after an immense earthquake which was felt even in Venice. In Heraklion, the town hall, the arsenal, churches, and castles all fell down. The harbour sank into the sea, with hundreds being washed away in the unrelenting grasp of the waves. Such stories caused the travellers to feel even queasier. What an unknowable world they traversed. What hidden depths lurked in the world's waters and the continual movement of the waves. Some of the pilgrims had already been having impure thoughts about their next stop, Cyprus, a reputed birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite, the deity of beauty and sexual desire. At Cyprus, a fertile island run by the Lusignan dynasty of French princes, and after them from 1489 by the Venetians, they were relieved to set their feet on dry land. Here the Lusignan lion, crowned and rampant, replaced its winged Venetian cousin on the reliefs and lintels of the fortified towns. Inland, Nicosia, Lefkosia, was the island's main ecclesiastical and governmental centre. Limassol, Paphos, Kyrenia, known as Dieu d'Amour, and Larnaca, Salino, were also regularly called out as places to moor the galleys. Famagusta, on the island's eastern side, had the best harbour. In these towns lived Latin Christians, who looked to the Pope in Rome, alongside Greeks, Armenians, Copts, and other Christians, in their multiple sects of Chaldeans, Jacobites, Maronites, Melkites, Jewish devotees, and a few Muslims, all with their churches and temples and tombs and different languages, but often sharing sacred spaces and rituals. Look out! Mermaids and sirens are beautiful and very rare. Sailors report that they are terribly dangerous. The mermaid may appear in the waves with a mirror and a comb, preening and adoring herself. The siren may sing, pluck a harp, or blow a horn, causing the mariner to fall asleep, lose his reason, or start to weep. Mariners may well weep in recalling the mermaids and sirens of old who lured sailors to the shore to fornicate with them. If the sailor refused, the mermaid ripped him to pieces and ate him. Cyprus was only a day's sailing on a good day from the coast of the Holy Land. The proximity of the Bible could be felt on this island full of miracle-working shrines and relics of the saints. Pilgrims were especially fond of visiting a site, St. Catherine's Prison, or sometimes St. Catherine's Tomb, at Salamis, which they believe had played a key role in the life of the Holy St. Catherine of Alexandria. Her uncle was said to have been the governor of Cyprus. The prison cell, or tomb, was in fact a megalithic monument and burial chamber thousands of years older even than Catherine, but a crude altar decorated with icons had been built there in the Middle Ages. If they didn't venerate Catherine here, visitors could do so in the magnificent, flamboyant cathedral built in her honour in Nicosia, now the Hayder Pasha Mosque, another site of the saint's tomb. Pilgrims came to this site in great numbers, and here they could get a pilgrim badge showing half the broken wheel on which Catherine had suffered. Without worrying too much about which historical moment in Catherine's eventful but short life was being commemorated, it was much easier to venerate the saint here rather than going all the way to her main shrine at Sinai. Another arresting site for medieval visitors was the monastery of St. Nicholas of the Cats, beside the great salt lakes of Akrotiri. According to local legend, the monastery was founded in the time of Constantine, on condition that 100 cats were kept there to destroy the area's noisome snakes. Felix Fabry found it a charming tradition when he visited in 1480. During the day, the cats roamed about the woodlands surrounding the monastery, and at their dinner time, a monk rang a bell. All the resident cats would hurry down to be fed. For Fabri, the cats represented the good angels, the hunted snakes, the evil ones. The most popular holy place for visitors to Cyprus was the Hill of the Holy Cross at Stavrovouni, between Larnaca and Nicosia. After passing through a landscape of lush citrus and mulberry groves on their hired horses and donkeys, they found an ancient monastery atop a mountain. The air there was thin and pure, and visitors gained remarkable views across the whole of the south of the island. At the monastery, visitors were shown the cross of the good thief. On this cross, it was said, had hung the body of the penitent crook Dismas, who suffered alongside Jesus and asked him to remember him as they died together. Additionally, there was said to be a nail from Christ's own cross, brought here by the holy archaeologist St. Helena herself, nailed into Dismas's cross. The cross at Stavrovouni was said sometimes to hover, suspended, unsupported in the air, held up by the Holy Spirit. Daniel of Kiev, a pilgrim visiting in 1107, said that he had seen this miraculous thing himself with his own eyes. The monastery was a pilgrimage site in its own right for those en route to Jerusalem, and unwell mariners were especially encouraged to visit the cross, either for a remedy to their sickness or to prepare their souls for death. In 1426, the monastery was attacked by Mamluks during an attempt to occupy the island and its fabric damaged. The miraculous cross was taken apart, according to the Sultan's vizier, Khalil. The Mamluks carried it off and found that it only seemed to float in the air thanks to the cunningly devised springs concealed inside. Stavrovouni remained a place that Christian pilgrims visited, but by the later 15th century, its cross had been encrusted in gold and silver and no longer floated. Sometimes it was hung up on cords in a window and could be rocked to and fro as a memory of its former airborne miracle. The cross relic was guarded by a sole monk, a sacristan, who had been abandoned by his brothers and sat alone, guarding this piece of holy cypress wood. Felix Fabri, visiting Stavrovouni in 1480, believed that the cross still hung without any visible supports, but did not want to examine it too closely in case he offended God. "I ascended this mountain to honor the cross," wrote Brother Felix carefully, "not to find a miracle or to tempt God." While the landscape of Cyprus was dappled with holiness, the port city of Famagusta was most certainly not a holy place. Famagusta was a boom town of medieval travel, transformed from a village by Crusader refugees after the fall of Acre in 1291. The city was governed by the Lusignans from the 1290s until it was occupied by the Genoese in 1372, and then in 1489 by the Venetians, who made it their capital. The Lusignans arrayed it with a grand cathedral, a bishop's palace, several churches, 3 monasteries, and a shopping street, and started its magnificent fortifications. At the harbour, there was a concourse bustling with merchants and pilgrims. Famagusta rapidly became Cyprus's main port, its dusty purlieus the destination for pleasure and vice. The German priest and pilgrim Ludolf of Suchem, visiting around 1337, said Famagusta was the richest of all cities, and her citizens are the richest of men. It had a very deep port and, located as it was on the island's eastern side, became its main entrepot with the east. Aromatic herbs from India, camlet and damask cloths from the Levant, and Turkish and Circassian slaves were traded through the city. Travellers were surprised and awed by the Famagustans' luxurious and exotic clothing. The men wore long silk gowns trimmed with gold braid and pearls, and boots with upturned toes, the kind seen in the Mamluk Empire. The women were largely covered in black, decorated, pleated cloaks, their embroidered mantles covering most of their faces. The city boasted a large number of taverns, many of them owned by expatriate Italians, which catered for locals, sailors, pilgrims, and pirates. The legal records of the time give us a sense of a traveller's night out in a tavern in medieval Famagusta. One evening in 1428, a priest named Antonio Mansur was visiting the city from Pera, the Genoese enclave in Constantinople. Mansur was at a tavern with friends to have food and some drinks. In a nearby corner of the tavern was a Famagustan named Bissara, with his own companions, and the two groups started to talk and drink and carouse together. dining on bread and pasta and pouring Greek wine down their throats. Mansour was holding the bread knife when, entirely accidentally, his hand slipped and he stabbed Bizarra in the chest, fatally wounding him. Antonio was arrested and once he had made it clear he was a priest, was handed over to the Latin bishop of Famagusta. He was put in the bishop's prison. Antonio escaped and managed to get on a boat to Rome, where he sought absolution and was cleared of all accusations against him. On another occasion, a brawl broke out in Antonio Coggio's tavern in Famagusta between the landlord and one Bartholomew of Pera. In the course of the fight, Coggio struck another guest, Azar de Caffa, visiting from the Crimea, on the head with a jug of wine. Azar's skull was split open and he had to stay in bed for a month, before missing a further 17 days of work. He also incurred various expenses for medicines and, as he complained to the authorities, had to pay for extra hairdressing too. These tavern brawls among visitors give us an idea of what could go wrong far from home, especially when wine was involved. Famagusta was also infamous for its sex workers. Ludolfo Suchem noticed the incredibly wealthy courtesans. He blamed this on the Cypriot soil, which he said provoked men to lust through its association with Aphrodite. Similarly, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, later Pope Pius II, died 1463, described the women of Famagusta as exceedingly wanton. He said that, in the holy name of Venus, they gave their bodies over to visiting sailors. There were even 2 memorials to Aphrodite in the cathedral in Nicosia and outside the Venetian palace in Famagusta, as if lust had become the object of veneration. As the travellers went further east and further from home, their minds seemed to wander more and more towards matters of the flesh, led by the thrillingly intemperate sensuality of foreign parts. The travellers were at risk of falling under the erotic spell of being abroad. A poem about sea travel. Sir Nicole Louve, also known as Nicole Lowe, was a wealthy gentleman from Metz in Lorraine. In the spring of 1428, he travelled to the Holy Land in a Venetian galley. He returned in the same year with 2 parrots he had acquired during his journey. During his return trip in December, he wrote this satirical poem about the appalling experiences he suffered during his sea voyage. A ballad by Sir Nicole Louve, knight made at sea on returning from the Holy Sepulchre in the year 1428. Whoever wishes to embark aboard a pilgrim galley must take courage in both their hands, because they will be slobbering from the moment they depart from the home port. On board, you can't be too picky about dining, because you'll often have to eat more than your fair share of putrid food. There's no shade on the boat's deck, and you're roasted by the sun. You eat rotten biscuits, and here everyone has to drink terrible-tasting coarse wine. Here, everything is done to stimulate your appetite. When we're seated at the communal dining table, we realize it's less than 6 feet from where everyone empties their guts. I must also tell you, you're completely at the mercy of the wind. The wind's the galley's real master, and no one else can help. The wind calms the boat as he pleases or makes her strike out at full speed. Don't rely on the patron, the commander, or the oarsman. They're suffering too. The wind needs no fiddler to make the galley dance. So everyone looks dejected, shaking their heads from side to side and vomiting up their guts and innards. When the wind has decided to show its strength, there's nothing to do but pray to God to preserve you from danger. And storms are another thing, astonishing, very unpleasant, and dangerous. In strong winds, it's essential to drop anchor near a port. This can last for a long time, believe you me. As food starts to run out on board, we have to go ashore and wander about on foot. If one wants to go to bed, it's difficult to find relaxation or good rest. It's necessary to sleep in steerage, which totally stinks of the farts, the gassy vapours, the flatulence exhaled by human guts. It is simply disgusting. Here the fleas abound and lice are innumerable. Each of them persist in stinging and biting the poor sleepers who are trying to get some rest. In sum, to conclude on this subject, no one's obliged to go to the Holy Land. if you don't have the strengths and qualities I describe here. You must be animated by a great fervour which will help you endure all these evils. You must also be young and have a short memory to quickly forget them. Or, as I've written above, you must find in yourself the strength to face the danger, the fortunes of the sea, the fatigue, the bad smells, and the pestilence. Nevertheless, and when all is said and done, if you really want to see the Holy Sepulchre and visit the Holy Land, go without further delay. This poem was composed and completed at sea in the year 1428, on board a galley of 300 passengers in Solidarity, but there isn't one of them who could finish a bottle of cheap French wine. 6. A walking tour of Constantinople. Pera, Boukoleon, Hagia Sophia, Hippodrome, Equestrian Statue, Church of Christ Pantocrator, Church of the Holy Apostles, Lacanau Palace. To plunder and to conquer remain two enduring stimuli to travel. In 1204, a somewhat improvised army of Western Europeans led by Venetians launched an assault on the city of Constantinople. This assault, now known as the Sack of Constantinople, saw the Venetians wrest control of the city from its Greek rulers. Constantinople was described by its conquerors in breathless terms of wonder and awe. The Crusader knight and chronicler Geoffrey of Villehardouin wrote that those who had never before seen Constantinople stared on it earnestly, for they never thought there could be in all the world so rich a city. They admired the high walls and strong towers that enclosed it, the palaces and churches, of which there were so many that no one would have believed it who had not seen it with his eyes. For Villehardouin, Constantinople was an astonishing jewel to be possessed, a superlative city. We may call the 1204 assault a crusade, but it was as much about trade and trading privileges as it was about faith, about who would control the Black Sea, who would best pay the Venetians, and who had access to the markets flowing in and out of the city. Throughout the Middle Ages, people visited Constantinople because they wanted to conquer it, or, failing that, because they wanted a part of its great wealth. The city formerly known as Byzantium had become a teeming megacity between Europe and Asia. Constantinople was the largest city in the medieval West, with a population of approximately 80,000 people, around 1350. This was still much diminished by war, plague, earthquakes, and migration from the city's peak of perhaps up to 500,000 residents in the 6th century. Set across a vast walled area over 7 hills on a tricorn peninsula, Constantinople was a place where for many visitors an august past collided with a precarious present. The Florentine traveller, Cristoforo Buondelmonte's 1420s maps of Constantinople, show classical antiquities and decorated columns set among crumbling ruins, domestic housing sprawling across the landscape between gigantic basilicas and imperial palaces, stark defences and walls, windmills, and numerous harbours around the peninsula. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Constantinople's populace comprised a Greek Christian majority with established communities of Albanians, Almaphitans, Armenians, Bulgars, Catalans, Genoese, Hungarians, Pisans, Ragusans, Turks, and Venetians, together with a large Jewish population. The city was in constant contact and dialogue with Latin Christendom and Islam, a true cosmopolis, a world city, the world in a city. The city is everywhere defined by its relationship to the sea, especially the Bosporus, the channel linking the Black Sea with the Sea of Marmara, and ultimately the Aegean and the Mediterranean. During the day, the seascape seems to reflect light back onto the city's breezy hills and their cypresses, cedars, oaks, and fig trees. At night, the sea becomes vastly black, the pale stones of the waterfront battlements kissed by winds coming off the waves. Visiting in the 1330s, by which point the city was no longer under Venetian control, but was again ruled by the Byzantine Greeks, the German pilgrim Ludovus Suchem gave an awestruck and detailed description of Constantinople. An exceedingly beautiful and very great city. He describes its many kilometers of walls, the triangular shape of its main peninsula, and its sundry and divers ornaments built by the Emperor Constantine, who named it Constantinople. He listed the city's impressive churches and the cheap plenty of bread, meat, fish, the many different nations who dwelled there, the city's cold weather. In November, Constantinople is often colder than Ludov's native Saxony, and the immense quantity of turbot to be caught there, exported to all parts of Asia. And yet, for all its wonder, Constantinople was defined by Ludov by what had been lost. "The reader should know," he wrote, "that the emperor of the Greeks and the Greek people once ruled over the whole of Asia, both the Greater and the Lesser." By Greater and Lesser Asia, Ludov meant Asia Minor, the Anatolian Peninsula, and Asia Major, the land beyond Anatolia to the east, covering what we now might term Central Asia. Constantinople's power had since been hugely diminished, divided from the Church of Rome by schism, and through territorial losses. In spite of its grand monuments, later medieval Constantinople was repeatedly represented as a place of dispossession and precariousness, an isolated shadow of its former self, racked with a kind of imperial melancholy. In the following pages, we will take a tour of Constantinople's main sites as they appeared to a visitor of the early 1430s, Bertrandon de la Brocquière, who described the city with one eye on its past glories and the other on its future conquest. Bertrandon was from a noble family of La Brocquière, a village on the river Garonne just north of the French Pyrenees. As a young man, Bertrandon entered the service of the Burgundian court at Dijon. He gained the role of carver to the Duke of Burgundy, supervising the presentation of meats at banquets. By 1425, Bertrandon had a generous annual pension of 160 francs from the Duke, Philip III, the Good, 1396 to 1467. He became part of the Duke's inner circle and, in 1428, received the Burgundian town and seigneury of Vieux-Château. Bertrandon became a trusted diplomat spy for Duke Philip. In 1432, he received £200 to undertake a certain long-distance voyage. This was a reconnaissance mission to the Middle East. Bertrandon was asked to report on the state of the Ottoman Turks as they steadily annexed Byzantine Christian territory. Duke Philip harboured romantic ambitions of being a chivalrous crusading hero like princes of old, to eject the Muslims from the Holy Land and repulse them in their further attempted encroachments on Christendom. He also wanted to avenge the failed Crusade of Nicopolis of 1396 at the fortress of Nicopolis on the Danube. Here his father, Philip II, the Bold, and his brother, John sans Peur, Fearless John, had unsuccessfully fought the Turks. On completing his secret 18-month mission, Bertrandon was paid a further £800 by Duke Philip. Bertrandon's written report of his journey is full of personal detail about his travels, revealing him as a keen and independent sightseer who relied on locals and strangers to assist him. He sometimes travelled as an emissary or diplomat, but at other times he wore disguises of local dress, to visit mosques and to travel incognito. On the whole, he received a warm welcome as a representative of the Burgundian court and, later in his life, he enjoyed a busy career as a Burgundian diplomat to the French court. Bertrandon was a field researcher and fact-finder, travelling in order to provide a first-hand account of the state of the Eastern Mediterranean. Bertrandon set off in February 1432 and followed the pilgrim's route via Venice, Dalmatia and Cyprus. After visiting Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and Sinai, Damascus and Syria, Bertrandon made his way to Constantinople. During this journey, he befriended and was protected by an Egyptian named Mahomet. Throughout his written report, Bertrandon tells us a great deal about new foods he encountered. Caviar was acceptable when there is nothing else to eat. Clothing. In Syria, he bought knee-high red boots, as is the custom of the country. And languages. For example, at one point, a friendly Jewish man from Kaffa made a word list for him in Italian, Tatar, and Turkish, of everything that I might need on the road, for myself and for my horse. To travel is to gain knowledge, but the knowledge is often of an unexpected and extrinsic sort. Bertrandon's account of Constantinople provides a valuable tour of this teeming, conflicted, and fateful city. We start our tour not in Constantinople proper, but in the suburban district of Pera, now Beyoğlu, its name simply meaning beyond in Greek, and its walled large town Galata, Karakoy. The names Pera and Galata were often used interchangeably for the area. Pera lies across the waterway, not at all wide but very deep, of the Golden Horn to the northeast of Constantinople's historic peninsula. Bertrandon described Pera as inhabited in 1432 by Genoese merchants who governed the town along with Greek and Jewish colleagues. They were all under the lordship of an administrator, the potestat or podesta, who was also the Genoese ambassador at the court of the Byzantine emperor and was appointed by the Duke of Milan, who also took the title Lord of Pera. Pera had its own walls and defences, most visibly from 1349, the Galata Tower, a round Romanesque brick structure which replaced an earlier tower, called out to those arriving by sea, a familiar-looking beacon to Western eyes. The tower was a pretty and delicate conical bastion frilled with arches resembling the kinds of buildings painted in the illuminated manuscripts presented to Duke Philip's court. Bertrandon found Pera's port the handsomest of all I have seen, and met with the Duke of Milan's ambassador there to plot against the Venetians. Pera was the first port of call for many visitors from the West, effectively a well-developed colony for European travellers and expatriates. Bertrandon bumped into an old acquaintance, a Catalan merchant named Bernard Carme, whom he had last seen in the Flemish town of Bruges. Carme recognised Bertrandon and asked him to quit Pera in order to stay at his lodgings with him in Constantinople and visit the city at leisure. Bertrandon accepted his invitation, unable to resist a sightseeing tour with a resident expat. Advice: to enter Constantinople is like entering a great forest. It's impossible to get around without a good guide. If you attempt to get around tight-fistedly or cheaply, you won't be able to see or kiss a single saint's body unless it happens to be that saint's holy day, where one can see and kiss the relics. Next, Bertrandon crossed over to the peninsula in the shape of a three-pointed shield of Constantinople proper. Pera was then linked to the city by ferries. There was no bridge, crossing the 500 metres of the waterway called the Golden Horn, the mouth of which was usually blocked by a massive iron chain, so the Constantinopolitans could control shipping. From Pera, Bertrandon appraised the 7 hills across which Constantinople is built. He noted that Rome and Antioch too are built across 7 hills. Like many travellers, he looked for what makes a city similar to others, not unique. Bertrandon marvelled at the size of the city, which he averred was 6 miles across and 18 miles in circumference. In his opinion, it was not as big and built up as Rome. In fact, Constantinople's population was around double that of Rome. He first described La Baccherne, the Blackeneye, a fortified palace at the northern extent of the city walls. This was a complex of luxurious halls elegantly built in light brick on a tumble of terraces. The ruins can still be seen. The Blackeneye was the centre of imperial authority, to where the emperor, then John VIII Palaiologos, and Empress Maria of Trebizond resorted and where visiting dignitaries were received. Bertrandon noted the rather deep moats defending the palace, but identified this as a potential weak spot for it is here that the attack of 1204 was successful. Like so many visitors of the time, as he admired the city, he pondered how it might be most easily captured. Memories of conquest and defeat marked the next place Bertrandon visited, the harbour of Boucaleon, on the shores of the Sea of Marmara. He did not describe the imperial Boucaleon palace that once stood here. By this date, the palace had already fallen into disrepair. Instead, his curiosity was piqued by a burial site he was shown, a hillock of bones of Christians who were leaving Jerusalem and the Holy Land and Acre, at the first time of the Crusade, the 1090s. Bertrandon was told that the Greeks had ferried a great number of these Christians over to this place, out of sight of other people, and killed them all. Other crusaders heard about this and fled to the shores of the Black Sea. So, Bertrandon claimed appeared Circassians, Avars, Mingrelians, and other Christian peoples in the area. His account is not historically accurate. The Caucasian Christian communities long predate the 1090s, and the site was, in fact, full of graves of Venetians chased out of the city by Greeks in 1261. However, It reveals popular Western impressions of the city's Greek rulers and Bertrandon's way of tying the entire history of the region back to the Crusades, an attempt to make sense on his terms of the area's complicated history of strife and multiple identities. Bertrandon then made his way to the most remarkable and principal of Constantinople's many churches. This was the Church of St. Sophia, the mother church where the Patriarch is located. On the summit of Constantinople's first hill, near where the city's triangle gestured into the Bosporus towards Pera and Asia. Dedicated to Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, but often understood to be dedicated to a saint named Sophie, this massive circular church always inspired awe in visitors. First dedicated in the year 537, and still standing despite its position above a major fault line, the church was noted for its stupendous grandeur and enormous dome. It was built on a raised plateau above the Byzantine city's main harbours and commercial districts, and gives at once a sense of elegant height and solid permanence. It is constructed as a series of vaulted buildings, rising and culminating in its dome, the biggest in the world aside from Rome's Pantheon. Bertrandon remarked on the church's sculpted white marble and the pillars in several colours. Indeed, the church's patterned marbles came from across the world, from the French Pyrenees to Asia Minor. The marbles alternate between red panels with thick pink veins and light grey panels marked with dark grey triangles, interposed with beautiful lintels swirled with crimson and off-white. The interior of the church was then decorated with golden mosaics showing Christ, the saints, and the Byzantine emperors in sensitive, lifelike poses. One such mosaic survives in the south door vestibule, depicting the Emperor Justinian, his handsome head bowed respectfully, handing a miniature version of the domed church to the Virgin Mary, while Constantine hands her a tiny version of the enormous walled city. In the south gallery, under the dome, a later mosaic shows Emperor John II Komnenos, reigned 1118-43, presenting a money bag to Christ and the Virgin. Abundant graffiti was scratched into the walls by visitors in languages from Old Slavic Glagolitic to Norse, and showing saints, ships, birds, angels and beasts, lasting traces of the diversity of people who had flocked there. Hagia Sophia, after being ransacked in the assault of 1204, held fewer relics than it once had, and in particular its holy lance had started a western migration and multiplication, purchased in the mid-13th century by Louis IX of France via Venetian brokers. Nonetheless, Bertrandon was told that the church still had the tip of the lance that pierced Christ's side, a relic then also being venerated in Paris. John Mandeville said he'd seen both, but was reticent about saying which, if either, he believed to be more authentic. Hagia Sophia also claimed Christ's robes, and another sponge on which Christ was offered gall, also claimed by Zadar, as well as the reed that was placed in Christ's hand in the Passion story. Bertrandon managed to see the gridiron of which St. Lawrence was grilled to death, a relic also claimed by Rome's Basilica of San Lorenzo in Lucina, and a basin-like stone on which Abraham served food to the angels who came to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis chapter 18, verses 1-15. At Hagia Sophia, Bertrandon's curiosity led him to stay and watch a divine service officiated by the Patriarch. He was evidently interested in both the local religious customs and the reputed beauty of the Empress Maria Magala Komnene, 1404-39. He viewed a kind of dramatic playlet representing the biblical story of Nebuchadnezzar and the three boys in the furnace, the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verses 1-30, a performance also noted by other visitors. Then he spent the entire day without eating and drinking, waiting for the Empress, as he wanted to see her close up and watch her mounting her horse. When he finally got a full view of her, he found her so beautiful, young and fair and a confident horsewoman. Her earrings were, in Bertrandon's eyes, especially noteworthy. They were made with large golden fastenings and decorated with precious stones, including rubies. Next, in front of Hagia Sophia, Bertrandon lingered in the Hippodrome, a large and handsome square surrounded with walls like a palace where games were performed in ancient times. The Hippodrome, a grand 3rd century arena 400 metres long, had curved arcaded viewing areas around a large oval track. It was still in use as a sports ground for horsemanship throughout the Middle Ages. The Seljuk physician Sharaf al-Zaman al-Marwazi died 1125, who visited Constantinople in the early 12th century, saw dogs set upon foxes, then cheetahs upon antelopes, then lions upon bulls, as the emperor, empress, and a crowd of onlookers watched and feasted. Shortly afterwards, the Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela described it as a place of amusement belonging to the king, where a great entertainment was held each Christmas with acrobatic and juggling shows and animal fights with lions, leopards, bears, with wild asses taking place there. No entertainment like this is to be found in any other land, Benjamin wrote in wonder. The Hippodrome was described by John Mandeville in the 1350s as a pretty court for jousting, with tiered seats in which one can sit and watch and not impede other people's views. A single retaining wall and lone stone bench from the Hippodrome survive today. Bertrandon watched as the emperor's brother, Thomas Palaiologos, 1409–65, despot of the Morea, exercised and sported at the Hippodrome. On horseback in the enclosure, Thomas and his retinue of 20 or 30 knights practiced their archery, competing with bow and arrow to pierce a hat thrown ahead of their galloping horses. This exercise, remarked Bertrandon, had been learned from the Turks. At the time of Bertrandon's visit, he would have seen at least 3 impressive ancient monuments on the Spina, the low wall running down the Hippodrome's centre. These were the Egyptian obelisk of Theodosius, erected 390 CE, an ancient bronze column of 3 intertwined serpents that had been placed there, circa 330 CE, by Constantine, and the monumental limestone column of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, Emperor 913–59 CE, placed at the south end of the stadium in the 10th century. Although Bertrandon did not comment on these unusual monuments, he would have walked through this strange parkland of memorials to fallen empires and past power. Visiting 10 years before Bertrandon, Zosimer, a deacon from Muscovy, repeated the folkloric belief that the serpent column held snake's venom and the column could be touched to cure the effects of a snake bite. The serpents' heads were broken off around 1700, but the column remains a strange and eloquent talisman that has witnessed the city's tumultuous history. Bertrandon then briefly described the very beautiful church of St. George, situated facing Turkey, i.e. across from what is now the Asian side of the city. He was here describing the church of St. George of Mangana, an important church east of Hagia Sophia, built on a lavish scale in the 11th century. It claimed various relics, including some of the hairs from Christ's beard. Nothing now survives of the church. Bertrandon then moved to the area between Hagia Sophia and the Hippodrome to describe one of Constantinople's most celebrated sites, a very high column of square stones with letters inscribed on it. This equestrian statue bewitched visitors to the city, and almost all of them attempted to interpret its meaning. It stood in the square, the Agora, outside Hagia Sophia, and was surrounded by salespeople selling food and drinks, perfumes, icons, and souvenirs. Travellers often have to rely on second-hand information to interpret their surroundings, or they are forced to accept their guide's descriptions without questioning them. According to what Bertrandon was told, atop the column was the Emperor Constantine, reigned 306–37, cast in metal on a great horse, holding a sceptre in his clenched fist, and his right arm extended with an open hand towards Turkey and the land route to Jerusalem. Bertrandon was told that this gesture was a sign all the territory as far as Jerusalem used to be under his control. In this reading, the statue was a remarkable monument to lost imperial authority. Robert of Clary, a Crusader knight visiting from Picardy in 1204, had described the statue somewhat differently. He saw a thick column 3 times as thick as a grown man's arm, 50 toises high, about 22.2 meters. At the top of the column was a stone about 1.5 meters square with the emperor on his horse, both cast in copper. The emperor stretched his hand out towards the heathen lands. The statue bore a legend that the Saracens would never have peace from the emperor. The Greeks identified the figure as the Emperor Heraclius, who reigned 610–41. On the horse's croup and on and around its head, 10 herons had made their nests. Robert's herons, possibly storks, add a nice touch of individual observation. The letters on the statue in Robert's reading declared that the Saracens should never have a truce with the Byzantine emperor, an anachronistic updating of the message which suited the Crusaders' needs and preoccupations. Robert also said that the effigy held a gold globe or orb with a cross, a symbol of global domination. For all its significance, visitors seem to have interpreted the statue in various ways, and even to have seen different things, which prompts the question, what do tourists see? And who tells them what they are seeing? Many visitors and most local accounts identified the statue as that of yet another emperor, Justinian, reigned 527 to 65. The effigy was in fact intended to depict Justinian, but was probably a reused statue of the earlier emperor, Theodosius, reigned 379 to 95. The Florentine mapmaker Cristoforo Buondelmonti, visiting circa 1420, noted that the statue was of Justinian, holding in his left hand a golden apple, while with the right hand he threatens the East and Turkey. The height of the column varies enormously across visitors' accounts, but they mostly saw the statue, like many statues, joining imperial authority with imperial anxiety. The emperor was an awesome sight, but his statue's meaning tended to straddle fantasies of imperial power with apprehension about imperial collapse. Bertrandon marvels, I have no idea how the statue was put up there given its size and its weight. It was about 30 meters high, the effigy alone on top of it over 8 meters high. It was one of the tallest freestanding columns in the world and one of the largest statues in the West. The Emperor Rider's nose was 23 centimeters long, according to one 16th century visitor who furtively measured it after the figure was dismantled. It showed the emperor in battle dress with a spray of feathers on his helmet. At several points, while it was still standing, massive bronze feathers fell from the statue, causing alarm among the city's residents. Around 1317, the orb's cross fell to the ground. Then, in the 1420s, the orb itself fell. Whenever bits of the statue came down, it was understood to be issuing a political commentary or prophecy. John Mandeville wrote that the figure used to hold an apple or globe in his hand, but the apple has fallen out of the effigy's hand. This, people say, was a symbol that the emperor has lost a large part of his empire. Mandeville added that any attempt to put the apple back into the statue's hand would fail, and that its other hand was held up towards the west, as a symbol by which to threaten sinners. Johann Schildberger, an adventurer hiding out in Constantinople in the early 1420s, said that the golden apple once indicated that the emperor had power over Christians and infidels, but now he had no longer that power, so the apple has disappeared. Almost all visitors to Constantinople found the equestrian statue to be a breathtaking testimony to the city's imperial pasts, present, and futures. For visitors, the column seemed almost to be alive in its capacity to change and in its prognostic ability to hold the city's precarious future in its massive hand. Visitors to Constantinople gazed on the statue in wonder at its size, its meaning. There was no one single medieval list of the wonders of the world. Although earlier Christian historians like Gregory of Tours died 594 and Bede died 735, had suggested such lists of places both biblical, Noah's Ark, the Temple of Solomon, and classical, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Capitolium at Rome. The equestrian statue at Constantinople achieved the status of a medieval wonder, a singular special thing that could not be fully comprehended, a sight to see, a historical object that solicited admiration and curiosity. Bertrandon also noted the nearby empty plinths of the gilded horses we encountered earlier rearing up on the front of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Until 1204, these horses, Bertrandon says 3, but actually 4, had been displayed here beside the Hippodrome. The cityscape was further scarred by its location on a tectonic fault line. There were several major earthquakes here, including in 1346, when the dome of Hagia Sophia cracked. Bertrandon then visited 2 proximal and important churches on Constantinople's 4th hill: the Church of Christ Pantocrator, the All-Powerful, and the massive Church of the Holy Apostles, the Church of St. Apostola. The Pantocrator, built by the Empress Irene in the 12th century, was a monastery that enjoyed a splendid panorama of Constantinople, Pera, and the Golden Horn, and included a large hospital with at least 50 beds, a library and scriptorium, a pharmacy, and a curative well. What most attracted Bertrandon's attention here was a relic of the Virgin Mary's tears. This took the form of a slab of stone on which Christ's corpse had been laid. It is a very holy thing, for you can see all the tears which Our Lady cried. The tears seemed to Bertrandon like wax, but upon closer inspection, more like congealed water. He assured his reader that many people have seen this. The relic Bertrandon saw was the Stone of Unction. The stone was said to have been brought to Constantinople in the 12th century and was described at the time as a red marble slab with the unique feature of the Virgin's tears on its surface. This was a directly parallel relic to the Stone of Unction in the doorway of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which Bertrandon had visited on his pilgrimage there and which had been in situ for over 100 years. Medieval travellers often saw the same thing in different places and did not seem to mind. Things could make religious sense rather than show historical veracity and still be just as meaningful. Bertrandon next visited the nearby Church of the Holy Apostles, built by Constantine as his mausoleum. The Holy Apostles, which was the model for St. Mark's in Venice, was described by Robert of Clary in 1204 as being even more sumptuous than Hagia Sophia. Bertrandon saw here the shaft of the column to which Christ was tied to be beaten on Pontius Pilate's orders. Bertrandon noted approvingly that it was of the same kind of stone as similar relics he had seen at Rome and Jerusalem. He also saw open wooden coffins which contained the incorrupt bodies of saints therein, and, mistaking the Holy Apostles for the Pantocrator, saw the tomb of Constantine and his mother, St. Helena, raised on 2.5-metre high columns. The Pantocrator church survives as the Zayrek Mosque, but its Stone of Unction does not. The Church of the Holy Apostles was comprehensively destroyed, and the Fatim Mosque built on the site between 1463 and 1470. Past the Holy Apostles in the northeast corner of the city, Bertrandon moved on to the reportedly small and badly roofed Church of La Bacquerne, part of the Blakeney Palace complex. Here he noted the church's wondrous adornments, paved, painted, panelled, and decorated in every possible way. This was the magnificent Church of St. Mary of Blakeney, mainly rebuilt by Alexis I around 1100, and the city's main sanctuary of its patron saint and defender, the Virgin Mary. This church contained an icon of the Virgin, covered in a veil which miraculously, on most Fridays, moved up slowly to reveal the Virgin's face. It then fell again slowly over the course of the next day. Bertrandon, like most other non-Greek visitors, does not seem to have been shown this icon. The church burned down in 1434, a couple of years after Bertrandon's visit. This was not, for once, through the violence of conquest, but from an accidental fire started by children. A tip. In Constantinople, there is a famous icon of the Virgin and Child called the Hodegetria, she who shows the way, painted by St. Luke himself. It's a wonderful large decorated icon held by the convent of the Hodegon near Hagia Sophia. It's shown every Tuesday. The icon is placed on the shoulders of blindfolded men, and it pushes and turns them about, this way and that, for they trust that through the icon she, the Virgin, truly shows the way. Having seen all these Greek churches, Bertrandon noted that the Latin merchants had their own church situated at the place where one took the ferry to Pera and where a daily mass was said in Latin. He seems to have been describing the Church of St. Nicholas at the Basilike Food Market, near the shore of the Golden Horn, on the northeastern side of Constantinople, overlooking Pera. The Church of St. Nicholas was essentially a Venetian church, and there was an icon of St. Nicholas to which sailors came to pray to guard against drowning, or to give thanks if they had been saved during a shipwreck. Some said that St. Nicholas's arm had reached out of the lifelike painting and given gold coins to the faithful. Bertrandon grew bored, sated by the city's churches. He wrote, "There are other churches that I did not go into," articulating the weariness of the diligent sightseer who has seen and said enough. He moved on to secular matters and the diverse merchants in the city, principally the Venetians and the Turks. The Catalan merchants showed Bertrandon around. On Candlemas Day, the 2nd of February, they took him to a solemn service with oddly dressed chanting chaplains at the imperial palace. The Empress Maria watched from a window in an upper apartment. When Emperor John learned from the Catalans that Bertrandon was from the Burgundian court, he sent a messenger asking for news of the capture of the Virgin of Orleans, Joan of Arc, executed in May 1431, just before Bertrandon arrived in Constantinople. It is a neat portrait of how news of current affairs travelled by word of mouth from west to east via wayfarers like Bertrandon. A few days later, the Catalans took Bertrandon to see the marriage festivities of one of the emperor's relatives, where he watched a strange kind of tournament. A great post was put in the middle of the square, and a large plank, 1 metre wide and 1.5 metres long, was attached to it. Around 40 unarmoured horsemen came galloping in one after the other, each with a small stick in his hand, and doing all sorts of tricks. Then, after around half an hour of this display of horseback acrobatics, 60 or 80 sticks were brought out. The mounted bridegroom took one of the sticks and charged as fast as the horse could go, as if jousting. He hit the target full tilt so that he broke his stick, without too much of a shock. Then some of the men started to shout and play instruments, drumming in the Turkish fashion. Then each man took his stick and rode at the target, each one breaking his stick. The bridegroom finished with 2 sticks bound together, and he broke them on the target without hurting himself. Bertrandon said it was well done, evidently having enjoyed the display. The emperor watched from a window with the empress too, who Bertrandon continued to find a very beautiful woman. Once the horseback joust was over, the party broke up with no one hurt, and everyone went back to their lodgings. Bertrandon saw a curious spectacle, a display of horsemanship with music, a tournament without violence, a wedding celebration at which no one was hurt. This was an entertainment at which battling with deadly swords could be replaced by flimsy sticks. The bridegroom proved himself in the emperor's eyes in a mock joust. It was as if this wedding celebration was a rehearsal for the men of Constantinople to fight a battle they knew to be inevitable. It is not clear exactly how long Bertrandon was in Constantinople, but his stay there was an extended one. He left the city on 23rd of January 1433, and later on his travels he met the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, 1404–51, at the then capital, Adrianople, Edirne. His account of the meeting is wide-eyed with wonder and exoticism, commenting on the 300 women and 30 boys the Sultan had at his disposal for his sexual pleasure. The Sultan, according to Bertrandon, could drink huge quantities, at least 6 or 7 quarts of wine. Bertrandon reported to Philip of Burgundy that he felt that the Ottomans would be easily defeated on account of their poor weaponry. Bertrandon would, within his lifetime, be proved wrong. Murad's successor, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, captured Constantinople for the Ottomans in 1453. The city rapidly became the thriving capital of an extensive Islamic empire that fundamentally changed the balance of power in and access to the Eastern Mediterranean. The city visited by Bertrandon was transformed. As the monuments of Byzantine Constantinople were repurposed or eradicated, his account of the city came to refer to a world in ruins. Some Travellers' Cost in Egypt and the Holy Land, 1392. Travellers in the Holy Land were required to pay for all the services they received. Prices were fixed by the Mamluks and Franciscans and were high. Here follows a selection of some of the prices of attractions and services in the Holy Land. To the guard at Alexandria port on leaving, 1 ducat per person. To a dragoman for the journey to Cairo, 6 ducats per group. For each camel to carry victuals to the galley on the River Nile, a day's journey, half a ducat. For galley passage on River Nile to Cairo, 12 ducats per group plus expenses for the dragoman's food. For the Sultan's permission to travel, half a ducat each. For the Lord of the Arabian Desert's permission to travel, 5 grossi each. Grossi were highly variable in value. In Venetian currency, a gold ducat was valued at 18 grossi in the 13th century. By 1440, the ducat was 28 grossi, according to William Brewin. And by 1496, the ducat equaled 80 grossi. For rough comparison, a cow would have cost about 2 ducats, 10 shillings in England, and a good horse about 44 ducats, 200 shillings in England. Inflation was low, but many charges to tourists could change without notice. To the master of the camels, that he might do his best, 3 ducats per group. For cameleers to St. Catherine's Sinai, 6 grossi each. For porters to bring one's things 2 miles from Gaza into Gaza, 3 ducats from all. Tribute to the Sultan at Gaza, half a ducat each. From Gaza to Jerusalem, 16 grossi per mile. For going to the River Jordan, 3 grossi each.